In the frozen heart of post-war Soviet Union, where the bitter winds of the Cold War had begun to howl across a world still bleeding from global conflict, a different kind of weapon was being forged. Not in the smoking factories of the military-industrial complex, nor in the secret laboratories where atomic nightmares were birthed, but in the elegant halls of what appeared to be nothing more than a prestigious ballet academy. Here, beneath the graceful facade of pirouettes and grand jetés, the most insidious program in human weaponization was taking its first, calculated steps. The year was 1947, and Joseph Stalin's paranoia had reached its zenith. The man who had helped crush Nazi Germany now turned his suspicious gaze westward, where former allies had become potential enemies overnight. The Americans had their super soldiers. Captain America had proven the devastating effectiveness of enhanced human operatives during the war. Though Steve Rogers was presumed dead, lost somewhere in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the threat he represented lingered like a specter in the minds of Soviet leadership. If the West could create one super soldier, they could create more. The Red Room was the Soviet Union's answer to that terrifying possibility. Deep within the shadowed corridors of the Lubyanka building, where the NKVD, soon to become the KGB, conducted its most classified operations, a woman known only as Madame B had been given an impossible mandate: create the perfect spy. Not merely an agent, but something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous. A weapon that could walk into any room, charm any target, and eliminate any threat without ever being suspected. A weapon that looked like a woman but thought like a machine. The Red Room Academy emerged from this vision like a malevolent flower blooming in the permafrost. On the surface, it appeared to be everything a prestigious ballet school should be. Grand halls lined with mirrors, bars polished to perfection, and the hauntingly beautiful strains of Tchaikovsky echoing through the corridors. Young girls from across the Soviet Empire were recruited, not kidnapped, the records would later show, but invited to participate in a program that promised to transform them into cultural ambassadors for the glory of the motherland. The truth, as always, was infinitely more complex and unutterably more sinister. Among the first wave of girls brought to the Red Room was a child who would one day shake the very foundations of the world. Her name, according to the falsified documents, was Natasha Romanoff, though even that identity was a carefully constructed lie. The child who walked through those doors had no real name, no true past, and no family to mourn her disappearance. She was, in the most literal sense, a blank slate upon which the Soviet state could write whatever stories served their purposes. At 7 years old, Natasha possessed the natural grace that had caught the attention of Red Room talent scouts, but more importantly, she displayed an analytical mind that operated with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster. Where other children saw a world of wonder and possibility, she saw patterns, weaknesses, opportunities. It was a gift that would make her the deadliest spy in history, but it was also a curse that would rob her of any chance at a normal childhood. Madame B, whose real name had been buried so deeply in classified files that perhaps even she had forgotten it, recognized something special in the young Natasha from the very first day. Where other instructors saw just another recruit, she saw the raw material for something unprecedented. The child's capacity for compartmentalization was remarkable. She could separate emotion from action with a facility that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The training began immediately, though it was presented to the girls as nothing more than an intensive education program designed to produce the finest cultural representatives the Soviet Union had ever known. Ballet was indeed taught, and taught to a level of perfection that would have been the envy of the Bolshoi. But between the dance lessons came other forms of instruction: languages, mathematics, history, and what the instructors euphemistically called social psychology. The psychological conditioning was the true heart of the Red Room program, a sophisticated form of mental architecture that slowly but inexorably replaced the girls' natural personalities with something far more malleable and infinitely more useful. Through a combination of hypnotherapy, memory manipulation, and carefully calibrated trauma, the children were systematically broken down and rebuilt according to precise specifications. Natasha's natural memories, what few genuine experiences a 7-year-old could possess, were gradually replaced with false ones. She was given a new history, complete with dead parents who had been heroes of the Soviet state, martyred in service to the motherland. This fictional tragedy served multiple purposes. It explained her presence at the academy, provided motivation for her dedication to the state, and ensured that she had no external emotional attachments that might compromise future missions. The process was not without its costs. As the weeks turned to months and the months to years, Natasha began to lose pieces of herself that she didn't even realize were disappearing. The ability to form genuine emotional connections atrophied like an unused muscle. The capacity for moral questioning was carefully excised, replaced with an unwavering dedication to whatever objectives were placed before her. Most insidiously of all, her sense of individual identity was slowly eroded, leaving behind only the role she was meant to play. Yet, even as the Red Room sought to create the perfect weapon, they could not entirely eliminate the spark of humanity that burned within their subjects. In quiet moments between training sessions, when the instructors were not watching, Natasha would sometimes catch glimpses of something that felt authentic, a flash of genuine emotion, a moment of unscripted connection with another girl, a dream that seemed to come from some deeper, untouched part of her psyche. These moments terrified her more than any aspect of her training, for they suggested that beneath the carefully constructed identity of Natasha Romanoff lay someone else entirely, someone who had been systematically murdered to make room for the Soviet state's vision of the perfect spy. The Red Room's methods were refined with each passing year, incorporating the latest advances in psychology and neuroscience. The program expanded beyond simple conditioning to include memory implantation using experimental techniques that bordered on science fiction. Some girls received entirely fabricated childhoods, complete with emotional associations so realistic that they could pass any psychological evaluation. Others were given multiple sets of memories, allowing them to inhabit different identities as the mission required. Natasha proved exceptionally receptive to these treatments, a fact that both pleased and concerned her handlers. Her malleable psyche could accommodate multiple identity overlays without apparent psychological damage. But this same flexibility made her difficult to predict and potentially difficult to control. Madame B made careful note of these observations in reports that would later inform the recruitment and training of subsequent generations of widows. As the Cold War deepened and the stakes of international espionage rose ever higher, the Red Room program evolved from an experimental initiative into a crucial component of Soviet intelligence operations. The Academy produced its first generation of operational assets, and the world began to whisper rumors of beautiful, deadly women who could seduce state secrets from the most guarded officials and eliminate threats with methods so subtle that their targets appeared to die of natural causes. But for Natasha, still a child despite her accelerated education and training, these whispers were just background noise to the relentless rhythm of her daily routine. Each morning brought new lessons in deception, new techniques for reading human nature, new methods for exploiting weaknesses that she was taught to identify with scientific precision. She learned to speak 17 languages fluently, to move through social situations with the grace of a dancer and the calculation of a machine, and to kill with tools as varied as poison lipstick and ballet slippers with razor-sharp ribbons. Most importantly, she learned that she was not Natasha Romanoff, citizen of the Soviet Union, but Black Widow, property of the state. The distinction was crucial, for it meant that her life belonged not to herself but to whatever handler claimed her services. She existed not as an individual with hopes, dreams, and desires, but as a carefully calibrated instrument designed for a single purpose: advancing the interests of the Soviet Union through whatever means necessary. And in the dark, cold halls of the Red Room Academy, as the young woman who would one day become one of Earth's mightiest heroes completed her transformation from child to weapon, the shadows that would define her entire existence began to take their permanent shape around her. The morning of Natasha's first kill dawned gray and unforgiving over the industrial cityscape of Prague, where autumn frost clung to the cobblestones like crystallized regret. She was 14 years old, though she possessed the poise and calculated demeanor of someone twice that age. The Red Room's conditioning had worked its terrible magic over the course of 7 years, transforming the nameless child into something that barely resembled a human being in any meaningful sense. She was, in the clinical terminology, preferred by her handlers, a perfected asset, a weapon of flesh and blood that could think, adapt, and kill with unprecedented efficiency. Ivan Petrovich watched from the shadows of a nearby cafe as his protege approached the target's apartment building with the fluid grace that had become her trademark. To casual observers, she appeared to be nothing more than a teenage ballet student, perhaps on her way to morning practice at one of Prague's prestigious dance academies. Her movements carried the ethereal quality that years of intensive training had burned into her muscle memory. But beneath the surface, Grace lay something far more predatory. Ivan had served as Natasha's primary handler for 3 years, ever since her graduation from the Academy's preliminary programs. He was a man caught between worlds, genuinely caring for the girl he had helped to mold, yet fully committed to the Soviet state that had created them both. The contradiction gnawed at him constantly, but he had learned to compartmentalize such feelings with the same ruthless efficiency that he had taught Natasha to embrace. The target was a Czech journalist who had been feeding information to Western intelligence agencies, a minor player in the grand chess game of Cold War espionage, but dangerous enough to warrant elimination. The mission had been designed as much to test Natasha's readiness for field operations as to eliminate an actual threat. Every aspect had been carefully calibrated to challenge her skills while minimizing the risk of exposure. Natasha entered the building through a service entrance, her lock-picking skills having been honed to perfection during countless hours of training. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her footsteps making no more sound than whispered prayers. The journalist lived alone on the 3rd floor, his apartment overlooking a courtyard where children played beneath the watchful eyes of their mothers. The irony of conducting an assassination in such a setting was not lost on her innocence and violence, coexisting in the same space, separated only by walls of brick and mortar. The elimination itself was accomplished with a precision that would have impressed even Madame B. A knock at the door, a carefully rehearsed story about being lost and needing directions, a moment of vulnerability that allowed her to step inside, and then death, delivered so swiftly and quietly that the journalist barely had time to register surprise before his life ended. Natasha had used a technique taught in the Red Room's advanced combat courses, a method that induced cardiac arrest while leaving no obvious signs of violence. To investigating authorities, it would appear that the man had simply succumbed to a weak heart. As she prepared to leave the apartment, Natasha paused at the window overlooking the courtyard. Below, the children continued their games, unaware that death had just visited their neighborhood. For a brief moment, something stirred within her, a flicker of emotion that felt foreign and dangerous. She recognized it as what her instructors would have called inappropriate emotional response, a malfunction in her conditioning that required immediate correction. But in that moment of stillness, gazing down at the playing children, Natasha experienced something that would haunt her for decades to come. Doubt. Not about the mission itself, which had been completed with textbook precision, but about the nature of the weapon she had become. The feeling lasted only seconds before her training reasserted itself, but those seconds were enough to plant a seed that would eventually grow into something far more dangerous to the Soviet state than any Western spy. Ivan was waiting for her at the designated extraction point, his weathered face betraying no emotion as she approached. He had monitored the entire operation from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but Natasha had performed flawlessly. Her transition from academy training to field operations appeared to be seamless, a testament to the effectiveness of the Red Room's methods. "Report," he said simply as they walked through Prague's winding streets toward their safe house. "Target eliminated," Natasha replied in the same emotionless tone she had been trained to use for debriefings. "No complications, no witnesses, time to completion, 14 minutes." Ivan nodded, making mental notes for the detailed report he would file with Moscow. But as they walked, he noticed something in Natasha's demeanor that concerned him, a subtle tension in her shoulders, a fraction of a second delay in her responses. These were the kinds of microscopic changes that Red Room training taught handlers to recognize. potential indicators of psychological instability or mission compromise. "Something troubling you?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of paternal concern that had made him such an effective handler. The question was both genuine care and operational necessity. A handler who could not read his asset's emotional state was a handler who could not maintain control. Natasha considered the question for several heartbeats before responding. The Red Room had taught her to analyze her own psychological state with the same clinical detachment she applied to her targets, and she recognized the anomalous emotional response she had experienced in the journalist's apartment. But she also understood that reporting such responses could result in immediate recall for additional conditioning, a process she had observed other trainees undergo, after which they returned changed in ways that were subtle but profound. "No," she lied, employing the same effortless deception that allowed her to inhabit false identities. The mission proceeded according to parameters. Ivan studied her face for a moment longer, his experienced eyes searching for signs of the emotional turbulence he suspected lay beneath her composed exterior. But Natasha's training held firm, her expression revealing nothing of the internal conflict that had begun to take root. He made another mental note for his report: possible emotional compartmentalization issues requiring monitoring, but decided not to press the matter further. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in Prague's Old Town, furnished with the kind of generic furniture and bland decorations that characterized Soviet intelligence installations worldwide. Natasha had stayed in dozens of such places during her training missions, each one identical in its careful anonymity. But this time, as she sat at the small kitchen table reviewing mission protocols, she found herself wondering about the people who had lived in these spaces before they were converted to their current purpose. The thought disturbed her more than the memory of taking a human life. Ivan prepared tea in the Russian style, a ritual that had become something of a tradition between them during their years of working together. As he moved around the small kitchen, Natasha observed him with the analytical detachment that had been drilled into her psyche. She noted the slight tremor in his left hand, early-stage Parkinson's disease, though he tried to hide it. She catalogued the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, recognizing the expression as what civilians called affection. The recognition triggered another anomalous emotional response. In the Red Room, handlers were tools, just as she was a tool. They existed to provide guidance and control, not emotional connection. Yet Ivan's obvious care for her well-being created a complex web of feelings that her conditioning had not fully prepared her to process. "You did well today," Ivan said as he placed the tea before her, his voice carrying a note of pride that would have been professionally inappropriate under normal circumstances. "The precision of your approach, the cleanliness of the elimination, it was textbook execution." Natasha nodded, accepting the praise as she had been trained to do. But beneath her composed exterior, she found herself treasuring the approval in ways that felt dangerously personal. The Red Room had taught her to value success in terms of mission completion and handler satisfaction. But this felt different, somehow more human, more real. They spent the next hour reviewing the operation in detail, analyzing every aspect for potential improvements and identifying lessons that could be applied to future missions. It was a routine debriefing, the kind of professional consultation that took place in intelligence agencies worldwide. But for Natasha, it represented something more significant: validation of her worth as more than just a weapon. The realization terrified her. As evening settled over Prague, painting the city's ancient spires in shades of amber and shadow, Natasha retreated to the small bedroom that had been designated as her quarters. The space was as anonymous as the rest of the apartment, furnished with a narrow bed, a simple desk, and a mirror that reflected back the face of a stranger, or perhaps, she thought with growing unease, the face of someone she was only beginning to know. She had been taught to see herself as Black Widow, the code name that defined her operational parameters and strategic value. But in the quiet moments between missions, when the adrenaline faded and the careful composure required for her work relaxed, she sometimes caught glimpses of something else in her reflection. Someone who might have been Natasha Romanoff, if such a person had ever truly existed. The doubt that had begun in the journalist's apartment grew stronger as the night deepened. For the first time since her conditioning began, she found herself questioning not just individual missions, but the entire system that had created her. The Red Room had given her purpose, skills, and identity, but at what cost? And more importantly, was the price she had paid the same one demanded of every person? Or had she surrendered something essential that others were allowed to keep? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one more dangerous than the last. By morning, when Ivan knocked on her door to begin preparation for their return to Moscow, Natasha had begun the long, treacherous journey toward becoming something the Red Room had never intended to create, a person with her own will. The winter of Ninateen, 62, arrived in Moscow with the kind of brutal cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the city, transforming the Soviet capital into a crystalline maze of frozen breath and chattering teeth. In the halls of the Kremlin, where the Cuban Missile Crisis had recently brought the world to the very brink of nuclear annihilation, the temperature seemed even more frigid than the weather outside. Natasha Romanoff, now 22 years old and considered one of the Red Room's most valuable assets, stood at attention in a conference room where the air itself seemed weighted with the gravity of global affairs. The mission briefing had been unlike any she had received before. Where previous assignments had focused on individual targets, journalists, defectors, minor intelligence assets, this operation would place her at the very heart of American strategic planning. She was to infiltrate the highest levels of the U.S. government, establish a network of compromised officials, and prepare for what her handlers euphemistically called systematic destabilization of Western democracy. General Alexei Shostakov, the Red Room's current director, paced before a map of North America that dominated the conference room's eastern wall. His voice carried the weight of a man who had witnessed Stalin's purges, survived Khrushchev's reforms, and now served in Brezhnev's increasingly paranoid administration. Each word he spoke seemed to carve itself into the cold air with the precision of a blade. "The Americans think they have won something," Shostakov declared, his breath forming small clouds of vapor despite the room's heating system. "Kennedy believes his performance during the missile crisis demonstrates strength. In reality, it has shown us exactly how fragile their democracy truly is. One decision, made by one man, nearly ended civilization as we know it. Imagine what could be accomplished if that one man were influenced by the right considerations." Natasha listened with the focused attention that 15 years of conditioning had burned into her nervous system. But beneath her composed exterior, something had begun to shift. The questions that had first emerged during her Prague mission had grown into full-fledged doubts about the rightness of her cause. Each subsequent assignment had added weight to these concerns, until she found herself carrying a psychological burden that threatened to undermine everything the Red Room had built within her psyche. Ivan Petrovich sat in the shadows at the back of the room, his weathered face betraying nothing of his own internal struggles. He had watched Natasha develop from a malleable child into the Soviet Union's deadliest operative, but he had also witnessed the emergence of something that troubled him deeply: independent thought. The girl who had once accepted every directive without question now asked subtle but pointed questions about objectives, methods, and consequences. More concerning still, she had begun to display what could only be described as a conscience. The transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not intimately familiar with her psychological profile. But Ivan had spent years studying every nuance of Natasha's behavior, and he recognized the signs of what Red Room psychologists called ideological drift, the slow erosion of conditioning that sometimes occurred in long-term deep-cover operatives. It was a condition that typically required immediate and intensive reconditioning, but Ivan found himself reluctant to recommend such measures, for reasons he could not entirely explain to himself. "Your cover identity has been prepared with unprecedented care," Shostakov continued, turning to address Natasha directly. "You will be Natalie Rushman, a graduate student in international relations at Columbia University. Your academic credentials are impeccable. Your background has been verified through multiple channels, and your psychological profile indicates exactly the kind of ambitious intelligence that attracts the attention of government recruiters." Natasha nodded, processing the operational parameters with the efficiency that had made her so valuable to the Soviet state. But as Shostakov outlined the mission's scope and timeline, she found herself thinking about the innocent people who would inevitably become casualties of her success. The officials she would seduce and blackmail, the intelligence assets whose careers she would destroy, the families that would be torn apart when her activities inevitably came to light. These concerns would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. The Red Room's conditioning had been specifically designed to eliminate such emotional considerations from operational decision-making. But something in Natasha's fundamental nature had proven resistant to complete psychological restructuring, and that resistance had grown stronger with each passing year. "Questions?" Shostakov asked, his tone suggesting that questions would be neither welcomed nor encouraged. Natasha hesitated for a moment that stretched far too long to be entirely professional. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that would have alarmed her handlers had they been paying closer attention to such subtleties. The American intelligence services have become increasingly sophisticated in their counter-espionage efforts, she said carefully. The recent exposure of several Soviet networks suggests that they may be employing new techniques for identifying foreign operatives. Have these developments been factored into the mission planning? It was a legitimate operational concern, the kind of practical question that any experienced agent might raise. But Ivan heard something else in her tone, a reluctance that bordered on resistance. She was looking for reasons to avoid the assignment, searching for logical objections that might delay or derail the mission entirely. Shostakov's response was swift and decisive. Soviet intelligence methods remain superior to anything the Americans can deploy against us. Your training and conditioning represent the finest achievements in human intelligence operations. Trust in your preparation, Comrade Romanov. Trust in the state that has invested so much in your development. The dismissal was final, but Natasha's doubts remained. As the briefing continued with detailed discussions of operational security and emergency protocols, her mind wandered to philosophical questions that would have horrified her instructors. Was the Soviet system she had been trained to serve actually superior to Western democracy? Were the freedoms enjoyed by American citizens merely illusions, or did they represent something genuinely valuable that her actions would help to destroy? Most dangerously of all, she found herself wondering what her life might have been like if she had been born in the West, raised in a system that supposedly valued individual liberty over state security. The briefing concluded with the usual ceremonial affirmations of loyalty to the Soviet Union and dedication to the mission's success. Natasha spoke the required words with the same conviction she had displayed for years, but the phrases felt hollow in her mouth, ritualistic incantations that no longer carried personal meaning. As the other officials filed out of the conference room, Ivan lingered behind under the pretense of reviewing mission documents. When they were alone, he approached Natasha with the careful deliberation of a man walking through a minefield. "You seem troubled," he observed, his voice carrying the paternal concern that had become his trademark over years of handling difficult assets. "Are there aspects of the assignment that concern you?" Natasha considered her response carefully. Ivan had been more than a handler to her. He had been the closest thing to a father figure that the Red Room system allowed. But that relationship also made him potentially more dangerous than any enemy agent, for he knew her psychological vulnerabilities with intimate precision. "I was thinking about the nature of sacrifice," she said finally, choosing her words with the deliberation of a chess master contemplating a crucial move. "The individuals who will be compromised by this operation, do they deserve what will happen to them?" It was a question that struck at the very heart of Soviet operational philosophy, and Ivan recognized it as such. The Red Room's conditioning was specifically designed to eliminate such moral considerations from an agent's decision-making process. That Natasha could even frame the question indicated a level of psychological independence that bordered on operational liability. But instead of reporting her concerns to his superiors, Ivan found himself engaging with her doubts in ways that surprised them both. "In war, soldiers die," he said quietly. "They may be brave, honorable people with families who love them and dreams they will never fulfill. But they are also enemies of our state, threats to our people's security and well-being. The fact that they are human beings with their own hopes and fears does not make them less dangerous to our cause." Natasha nodded slowly, recognizing the logic of his argument while remaining unconvinced by its moral foundation. "But what if our cause is wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if the freedoms we are fighting to suppress are actually worth preserving?" The question hung in the air between them like a live electrical wire, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Ivan stared at her for a long moment, seeing in her face the same doubts that had begun to plague his own conscience during the long, dark years of Stalin's reign. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of accumulated regret that seemed to age him before her eyes. "That, my dear Natasha, is the question that every intelligence operative must eventually confront. And the answer we choose determines whether we remain servants of the state or become something else entirely." It was the closest thing to philosophical rebellion that either of them had ever articulated, and they both understood the dangers inherent in such thoughts. But in that moment of shared honesty, the foundations of Natasha's eventual defection were quietly laid. Outside, the Moscow winter continued its relentless assault on the city, but inside the conference room, the first warm breath of spring had begun to stir. The year 1968 arrived, like a thunderclap across a world already trembling on the precipice of profound change. In Prague, Soviet tanks had rolled through ancient streets to crush the flowering hopes of liberalization, while in Paris, students and workers had brought the French government to its knees through sheer force of idealistic will. Across the Atlantic, America convulsed with civil rights struggles and anti-war protests that challenged the very foundations of its democratic institutions. And in the hidden spaces where the Cold War's shadow games played out, Natasha Romanoff found herself standing at the crossroads of history, her carefully constructed loyalties beginning to fracture under the weight of moral complexity. The mission that would forever alter her relationship with the Soviet state began with what appeared to be a routine intelligence-gathering operation in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Her cover identity as Dr. Natalie Rushman, a research psychologist specializing in behavioral modification techniques, had proven remarkably effective at providing access to the kind of social circles where government officials, defense contractors, and intelligence operatives mingled with casual informality. But what should have been a straightforward surveillance operation became something far more complicated when she encountered Anthony Edward Stark, heir to Stark Industries, and a man whose brilliant mind was matched only by his reckless disregard for conventional wisdom. Natasha had been tasked with assessing Stark as a potential asset for recruitment or elimination, depending on his perceived value to Soviet interests. The young industrialist's weapons manufacturing empire made him a crucial component of America's military-industrial complex, while his emerging interest in advanced technology research suggested possibilities that both intrigued and concerned her handlers in Moscow. Their first meeting occurred at a charity fundraiser for veterans' medical care, one of those glittering Manhattan social events where philanthropy and networking danced together in choreographed harmony. Natasha had positioned herself near the bar, employing the kind of strategic social positioning that Red Room training had taught her to execute with unconscious precision. When Stark approached drawn, as she had calculated he would be, by her carefully crafted combination of intellectual sophistication and subtle sensuality, she was ready with exactly the kind of conversation that would intrigue a man of his particular psychological profile. "The interesting thing about weapons," she said, as if continuing a conversation they had been having for years, "is that they reveal more about the people who create them than the people they're designed to kill." Stark paused with his martini halfway to his lips, his dark eyes registering the kind of sharp intelligence that had made him simultaneously one of America's most valuable citizens and one of its most dangerous wildcards. "That's either the beginning of a fascinating conversation or the setup for an assassination attempt," he replied with the wit that had made him a favorite of gossip columnists and a headache for corporate public relations departments. "Given the setting, I'm hoping for the former." What followed was exactly the kind of intellectual sparring match that Natasha had been trained to conduct, a careful dance of revelation and concealment designed to extract maximum information while revealing minimum truth. But as the evening progressed, she found herself genuinely engaged with Stark's perspectives on technology, morality, and the responsibilities that came with the power to reshape the world. More disturbing still, she found herself enjoying his company. The Red Room's conditioning had prepared her for many contingencies, but not for the possibility that she might develop genuine respect for a target. Stark's obvious intelligence and unexpected moral complexity challenged her preconceptions about American capitalism and its practitioners. Here was a man who had inherited a fortune built on weapons manufacturing, but who spoke thoughtfully about the ethical implications of his work, someone who wielded enormous influence, yet seemed genuinely troubled by the uses to which his inventions might be put. As the weeks turned to months and her surveillance of Stark deepened into what could only be called a relationship, Natasha began to experience something that the Red Room psychologists had assured her was impossible: moral confusion. The man she was supposed to assess as either an asset or a threat had become a mirror in which she saw reflections of her own ethical struggles. Their conversations ranged across topics that would have horrified her Soviet handlers: the nature of individual freedom, the morality of state power, the possibility that ordinary people might be capable of making wise decisions about their own lives, without guidance from authoritarian institutions. Stark challenged her assumptions about the inherent superiority of socialist systems, while demonstrating through his own actions that capitalism need not be synonymous with callous exploitation. Most dangerously of all, he treated her as an intellectual equal, something that no man in the Soviet system had ever done. In the Red Room, she had been valued for her skills and her obedience, but never for her mind. Stark seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, engaging with her ideas as if they had intrinsic worth rather than merely instrumental value. The psychological impact of this experience could not be overstated. For a woman who had been conditioned to see herself primarily as a weapon, the discovery that she might also be a person with legitimate intellectual and emotional needs created a kind of identity crisis that threatened everything the Red Room had built within her psyche. But it was her encounter with Clinton Barton that truly began the process of her transformation from Soviet asset to something approaching a free agent. Barton was investigating a series of technology thefts from defense contractors, thefts that Natasha knew were being carried out by Soviet intelligence operatives working under her coordination. The irony was exquisite. She was simultaneously the predator and the target, the hunter and the hunted, playing both sides of a game whose rules she was beginning to question. Their first meeting was operationally inevitable, given that both were circling the same targets, but the encounter's emotional impact caught Natasha completely off guard. Where Stark had challenged her intellectual assumptions, Barton confronted her with something far more dangerous: genuine human decency. The S.H.I.E.L.D. agent was everything the Red Room had taught her to despise about Western operatives: idealistic, emotionally open, committed to principles that seemed naively optimistic. But he was also brave, competent, and possessed of a moral clarity that made Natasha's own ethical compromises feel increasingly uncomfortable. More significantly, he saw through her cover identity with an intuitive understanding that bypassed all her carefully constructed deceptions. Not the specific details — he had no idea she was a Soviet agent — but the essential truth that she was someone playing a role rather than living an authentic life. "You know what I think?" he said during one of their carefully orchestrated accidental encounters. "I think you're the loneliest person I've ever met." The observation hit her like a physical blow, not because it was false, but because it was so obviously true. In all her years of training and operations, no one had ever seen past her professional competence to recognize the profound isolation that lay at the heart of her existence. The Red Room had created in her the perfect spy, but had also created someone who could never truly connect with another human being, someone who existed in a perpetual state of emotional exile. Barton's recognition of her loneliness created a kind of psychological emergency that threatened to undermine decades of conditioning. For the first time since her childhood, she found herself genuinely caring what another person thought of her, not as an operational consideration, but as a personal need. The implications terrified her. As autumn settled over New York City, painting Central Park in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of Moscow's brief, beautiful falls, Natasha stood at her apartment window, contemplating choices that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The mission that had brought her to America was proceeding according to plan. She had identified numerous potential assets and gathered intelligence that would be invaluable to Soviet strategic planning. But success felt increasingly hollow as she confronted the growing certainty that the system she served was fundamentally at odds with her emerging understanding of human worth and dignity. The conversations with Stark had opened her mind to possibilities she had never been allowed to consider, while her encounters with Barton had awakened parts of her personality that the Red Room's conditioning had sought to eliminate entirely. Most troubling of all, she had begun to recognize that the freedoms enjoyed by Americans, messy, chaotic, inefficient, though they might be, represented something genuinely valuable that her actions were helping to undermine. The woman who had entered the United States as a perfectly conditioned Soviet weapon was slowly becoming someone else entirely, a person capable of independent moral judgment, someone who could recognize the difference between serving a cause and serving the truth. The iron curtain that had defined her entire existence was beginning to crack, and through those fissures, the light of possibility was beginning to shine. The abandoned warehouse in Queens, where everything changed, smelled of rust, old concrete, and the kind of urban decay that New York City wore like a badge of honor. It was November 1969, and the mission that had brought Natasha to this desolate industrial wasteland should have been routine: eliminate a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who had gotten too close to uncovering Soviet operations, retrieve the classified files he had stolen, and disappear back into the shadows that had sheltered her for so many years. Instead, she found herself face to face with Clinton Barton, the man who had unknowingly spent months dismantling everything she had been taught to believe about herself and the world. The irony was not lost on her. The agent she had been sent to kill was the same person who had seen past her carefully constructed facades to recognize the loneliness that lay at the heart of her existence. The man who had awakened her conscience was now the target of her conditioning, and the collision between these two realities created a psychological crisis that threatened to tear her apart at the most fundamental level. Barton stood in the center of the warehouse's main floor, a compound bow held with casual competence in his hands, and an expression of grim determination etched across his weathered features. He had been expecting her not specifically, perhaps, but he had clearly anticipated that someone would come to silence him permanently. The classified files that had triggered this confrontation lay scattered across a makeshift table, their contents representing months of painstaking investigation into Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had characterized their previous interactions. "Though I have to admit, I was hoping I was wrong about you." Natasha stepped into the light cast by the warehouse's few functioning overhead fixtures, her movements carrying the predatory grace that years of Red Room training had burned into her muscle memory. She wore black tactical gear that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent illumination, and her weapons were arranged with the kind of professional precision that announced her deadly intentions without requiring verbal threats. But even as her body prepared for the violence that seemed inevitable, her mind reeled with the implications of what she was about to do. This was not an anonymous target, not some distant figure whose death could be rationalized as necessary for the greater good. This was Clint Barton, the man who had treated her as a human being rather than a weapon, who had seen her loneliness and responded with genuine compassion rather than tactical advantage. "You don't have to do this," Barton continued, his bow remaining steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "Whatever they've got on you, whatever they're threatening you with, there are other options. Better options." The words hit her like physical blows, not because they were manipulative, but because they were offered without apparent tactical consideration. Even now, faced with almost certain death, he was trying to save her rather than himself. The selflessness of the gesture created a cognitive dissonance that her Red Room conditioning had not prepared her to process. "You don't understand," she replied, her voice carrying the mechanical precision that had become second nature during operational situations. "There are no other options. There is only the mission." But even as she spoke the words, she recognized them as hollow echoes of programming rather than expressions of genuine belief. The months she had spent in America, the conversations with Stark, the unexpected connection with Barton himself, all of it had combined to create fractures in the psychological architecture that the Soviet state had constructed within her mind. Barton studied her face with the kind of analytical attention that reminded her uncomfortably of her own training in reading human nature. But where she had been taught to identify weaknesses for exploitation, he seemed to be searching for something else entirely, signs of the person he believed existed beneath the professional killer. "The mission," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "Is that what you call it when you murder people who've never done anything to hurt you?" The question struck at something fundamental that had been troubling her for months. The targets she had been assigned were not monsters or criminals. They were intelligence professionals doing their jobs, patriots serving their country, human beings with families and friends and dreams that would die with them. The moral equivalence that her Soviet handlers insisted existed between her work and theirs had begun to feel increasingly false. "They are enemies of the state," she said. But the conviction that had once given such phrases their power was notably absent from her voice. "Whose state?" Barton asked. "The one that stole you from your family when you were a child? The one that turned you into a weapon before you were old enough to understand what they were doing to you? The one that's kept you isolated and alone your entire life?" Each question was like a scalpel, cutting through layers of conditioning to expose wounds that had never been allowed to heal. Natasha felt something cracking inside her chest, not ribs or sternum, but something more fundamental. The certainty that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember was fracturing under the weight of Barton's relentless compassion. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered. But the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "I know enough," he replied. "I know that every time we talked, you looked like someone who was drowning. I know that you're the most competent person I've ever met, and also the saddest. I know that whoever trained you taught you to be a perfect weapon but forgot to let you be a human being." Tears began to fall from her eyes, an autonomic response that shocked her more than any physical wound could have. The Red Room's conditioning had included extensive emotional control training, techniques designed to prevent exactly this kind of psychological vulnerability during operational situations. That her body was betraying her programming so completely suggested that the damage to her conditioning was far more extensive than she had realized. "I can't," she said, the words barely audible above the warehouse's ambient noise. "You don't understand what they'll do to me if I fail." "Then don't fail," Barton said simply. "Choose something different. Choose to walk away from all of this and become whoever you were supposed to be before they got their hands on you." The suggestion was so radical, so completely outside the parameters of everything she had been taught to consider possible, that for a moment she could not even process its meaning. The idea that she could simply choose a different life, that she possessed agency over her own existence, was like a foreign language that she could hear but not comprehend. But gradually, as the silence stretched between them, the concept began to take shape in her mind. She could lower her weapon. She could walk away from the mission, from the Red Room, from everything that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember. She could become something other than a weapon. The choice terrified her more than any enemy she had ever faced. "They'll send others," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperate hope that she had never heard in her own words before. "If I don't complete the mission, they'll send other agents to finish what I started." "Let them come," Barton replied, with the quiet confidence that had made him so effective as an intelligence operative. S.H.I.E.L.D. is pretty good at protecting people who need protecting, and you're probably the best intelligence asset they could ever hope to recruit if you were willing to switch sides. The phrase "switch sides" reverberated through her consciousness like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. For the first time in her adult life, she was being offered a genuine choice, not between tactical options or strategic approaches, but between fundamentally different ways of existing in the world. She could remain Black Widow, the Soviet state's most valuable weapon, continuing to kill and manipulate and destroy in service to a cause she no longer believed in. Or she could become Natasha Romanoff, not the manufactured identity that had been imposed upon her, but someone real, someone who made her own choices and bore responsibility for her own actions. The weapon that had been aimed at Barton's chest began to shake in her hands, and then slowly, with movements that felt like the first steps of a newborn learning to walk, she lowered it to the warehouse floor. "My name," she said, her voice carrying a wonder that seemed to surprise her, "is Natasha Romanoff, and I think I'd like to find out who that person actually is." Barton's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long, brutal winter. "I think I'd like to help you find out," he said. And in that moment, in a decaying warehouse in Queens, with classified files scattered around them like fallen leaves, the Black Widow died, and something far more dangerous to the Soviet state was born. A woman with her own will, her own choices, and her own understanding of right and wrong. The Iron Curtain had not just cracked, it had shattered completely, and Natasha Romanoff stepped through the ruins toward a future she would create for herself. The Triskelion rose from the banks of the Potomac River like a monument to mankind's perpetual struggle between order and chaos, its 3 towering wings reaching toward a gray Washington sky that seemed perpetually weighted with the burden of global responsibility. Within its steel and glass walls, the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement, and Logistics Division conducted the shadow war that kept the world from sliding into the abyss of international anarchy. And in a sterile briefing room on the 37th floor, Natasha Romanoff sat across from Colonel Nicholas Joseph Fury, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she had ever felt in any hostile territory. 6 months had passed since the warehouse in Queens. 6 months since she had made the choice that transformed her from Soviet weapon into something approaching a free agent. The intervening time had been a whirlwind of debriefings, psychological evaluations, and careful negotiations between S.H.I.E.L.D. and various intelligence agencies who wanted either to recruit her or to see her prosecuted for decades of espionage activities. Fury had been her advocate throughout the process, arguing that her value as an intelligence asset far outweighed the symbolic satisfaction of putting her on trial. But she could see in his single remaining eye the wariness of a man who had survived too many betrayals to ever fully trust anyone, especially someone whose entire existence had been built around deception. "The thing about second chances," Fury said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority that had made him one of the most respected figures in the intelligence community, "is that they're usually last chances in disguise. You understand what I'm saying to you?" Natasha nodded slowly, recognizing the warning implicit in his words. S.H.I.E.L.D. was offering her something unprecedented, the opportunity to use her skills in service of ideals. She was still learning to understand, but that opportunity came with expectations that would tolerate no failure. "I understand," she replied, her voice carrying the precise diction that years of language training had burned into her speech patterns. "You're gambling your reputation on the possibility that I can become something other than what I was made to be." "That's part of it," Fury acknowledged. "But there's more to it than that. See, the thing about weapons is that they're only as good as the person wielding them. The Soviets made you into one hell of a weapon, but they never bothered to teach you how to choose your own targets." The observation struck her as profoundly accurate. The Red Room had given her skills that bordered on the superhuman, but it had never given her the moral framework necessary to use those skills responsibly. She was like a master craftsman who had been taught every conceivable technique, but had never been allowed to choose what to create. "What exactly are you offering me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A job," Fury said simply. "A chance to use everything they taught you to actually make the world a little bit safer instead of just rearranging the power structures. A chance to find out what Natasha Romanoff might accomplish if she was working for the right side." The phrase "right side" triggered a complex emotional response that she was still learning to process. For most of her life, moral questions had been answered by reference to state ideology. Whatever served Soviet interests was good. Whatever opposed them was evil. The simplicity of that framework had been comforting in its way, providing clear guidelines for every decision. But her experiences in America had shattered that moral certainty, leaving her adrift in a world where right and wrong were determined by principles rather than political allegiances. The freedom to make her own ethical choices was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "And if I fail?" she asked. "If the conditioning proves stronger than my intentions, if I revert to what I was trained to be?" Fury's expression grew even more serious, if such a thing were possible. "Then," "I'll put you down myself," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing the weather. "Nothing personal, you understand. But I won't let you hurt innocent people just because I was wrong about your capacity for change." The threat should have triggered her defensive reflexes, should have caused her to calculate escape routes and tactical advantages. Instead, she found herself oddly comforted by Fury's honesty. He was treating her as a dangerous but potentially valuable ally rather than a helpless victim or a reformed saint, and that realistic assessment felt more trustworthy than any amount of false reassurance. "What would my duties involve?" she asked, accepting the implicit terms of their arrangement. "Initially, proving that you can work with a team without betraying them, manipulating them, or getting them killed. We've got some low-level operations that need someone with your particular skill set, but nothing sensitive enough to compromise national security if you turn out to be running a very long con." Fury slid a manila folder across the table, its contents representing her first assignment as a S.H.I.E.L.D. operative. The mission briefing was straightforward surveillance of a suspected arms dealer operating out of Marseille. Intelligence gathering, rather than direct action, the kind of assignment that would test her abilities without providing opportunities for spectacular betrayal. But as she reviewed the operational parameters, Natasha realized that she was experiencing something entirely new: enthusiasm for work that served a cause she believed in. For the first time in her adult life, her formidable skills would be employed in service of ideals that aligned with her emerging moral convictions. The transition from Soviet asset to S.H.I.E.L.D. operative proved more challenging than she had anticipated. The practical aspects were relatively straightforward: learning new communication protocols, adapting to different operational procedures, adjusting to technology that was generations ahead of anything the Red Room had provided. But the psychological adjustments required were far more complex. Working with a team, for instance, required a fundamental shift in thinking that challenged decades of conditioning. The Red Room had trained her to operate as a solitary agent, to trust no one completely, and to always maintain options for betrayal or escape. But S.H.I.E.L.D's operational philosophy emphasized cooperation, mutual support, and shared responsibility for mission success. Her first partner was Agent Phil Coulson, a mild-mannered man whose unassuming appearance concealed one of the sharpest tactical minds she had ever encountered. Coulson approached their partnership with the patient professionalism of someone who understood that trust was something that had to be earned rather than assumed. But he never made her feel like she was being tested or evaluated. "The thing about working with former enemies," he told her during their first mission briefing, "is that they often make the best allies. They understand the stakes better than people who've never been on the other side." Their initial operations together were exercises in careful mutual evaluation, each testing the other's capabilities and reliability without exposing critical vulnerabilities. But gradually, as mission followed successful mission, something approaching genuine partnership began to develop between them. Coulson taught her to see intelligence work as something more than a zero-sum game between competing powers. S.H.I.E.L.D's mandate was broader and more complex than simple national interest. They were tasked with protecting humanity itself from threats that transcended political boundaries. It was a perspective that resonated with the moral awakening she had experienced during her time with Barton. But integrating into S.H.I.E.L.D's culture required more than just operational adaptation. She had to learn to function in an environment where her colleagues were not assets to be manipulated or competitors to be defeated, but genuine partners whose success contributed to her own. The concept of shared victory was as foreign to her as the idea of voluntary cooperation. Maria Hill, S.H.I.E.L.D's deputy director, proved particularly challenging to work with, not because she was hostile, but because she represented everything Natasha had been trained to distrust about Western intelligence operations. Hill was competent, dedicated, and genuinely committed to protecting innocent people, but she was also idealistic in ways that seemed dangerously naive to someone raised in the Red Room's cynical environment. You keep waiting for me to reveal some hidden agenda, Hill observed during one of their joint briefings. Some secret motive that explains why I do this work. Everyone has hidden agendas, Natasha replied, the response automatic after years of operational paranoia. Maybe, Hill acknowledged. But sometimes the hidden agenda is just wanting to live in a world where your kids can grow up without being afraid all the time. The simplicity of the statement was devastating in its honesty. Natasha had been prepared for complex ideological arguments, sophisticated justifications for American hegemony, or calculating explanations of strategic necessity. She had not been prepared for someone whose primary motivation was protecting children she would never meet from threats they would never understand. As months passed and her integration into S.H.I.E.L.D. deepened, Natasha began to understand that she was not simply switching sides in the Cold War. She was joining something that transcended traditional geopolitical boundaries. S.H.I.E.L.D's mission was fundamentally different from anything the Red Room had prepared her for, and that difference required her to develop new capabilities that had nothing to do with combat skills or espionage techniques. She had to learn to care about outcomes beyond mission success. She had to develop the capacity for genuine loyalty to people who might never be able to reciprocate her trust completely. Most challengingly of all, she had to accept responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her immediate operational objectives. The process was neither smooth nor certain. There were moments when her Red Room conditioning reasserted itself, when she caught herself analyzing her colleagues as potential targets or escape routes. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if her defection was just another elaborate deception, something her Soviet handlers had planned all along to place a deep-cover asset at the heart of Western intelligence. But gradually, as successful missions accumulated and her relationships with her S.H.I.E.L.D. colleagues deepened, she began to recognize that she was becoming someone genuinely different from the Black Widow who had entered that warehouse in Queens. The change was not complete, might never be complete, but it was real and growing stronger with each passing day. Fury, watching her development with the analytical attention of someone whose job required him to assess human nature with scientific precision, gradually began to increase the scope and sensitivity of her assignments. Her success in Marseille led to more complex operations in Budapest, then Prague, then locations where her unique combination of skills and experience made her irreplaceable. But it was during a seemingly routine surveillance mission in Moscow, the first time she had returned to Soviet territory since her defection, that she truly understood how complete her transformation had become. Standing in Red Square, watching tourists photograph the Kremlin walls that had once represented the absolute center of her universe, she felt nothing but a profound sadness for the woman she had been. The ideology that had once given her life meaning now seemed like a collection of empty phrases designed to justify the unjustifiable. The state that had claimed her loyalty had never deserved it, and the cause she had served had been built on lies that she was only now beginning to fully understand. But more importantly, she recognized that she had become someone capable of independent moral judgment, someone who could choose her own battles and fight for causes that aligned with her conscience rather than her conditioning. The Black Widow was truly dead. In her place stood Natasha Romanoff, S.H.I.E.L.D., agent, protector of innocence, and guardian of ideals that she was still learning to articulate, but which felt more authentic than anything she had ever known. The concept arrived in a file marked with security classifications so restrictive that Natasha had to submit to additional background checks just to be informed of its existence. The Avengers Initiative, a theoretical framework for assembling Earth's most capable defenders into a coordinated response team for threats beyond the scope of conventional military or intelligence operations. On paper, it read like science fiction. In practice, as Fury explained during a briefing that felt more like a confession than a strategic presentation, it represented humanity's last desperate gamble against forces that defied comprehension. "The world is getting stranger," Fury said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed too much impossible nonsense to maintain any illusions about the limits of reality. "We've got gods walking around in primary colors. billionaires building flying suits of armor in their garage, and scientists who turn into green rage monsters when they get angry. The old ways of keeping the peace aren't going to cut it anymore. Natasha studied the psychological profiles spread across the conference table with the analytical attention that had made her such an effective intelligence operative. Tony Stark, brilliant but narcissistic, carrying guilt that manifested as messianic compulsions. Steve Rogers, a man displaced in time, struggling to find his place in a world that had moved beyond his understanding. Bruce Banner, a gentle soul housing a monster that could level city blocks in minutes of uncontrolled fury. Thor, an alien prince whose very existence challenged humanity's fundamental assumptions about its place in the universe. Each profile represented formidable capabilities, paired with psychological complexities that would make team cohesion extremely challenging. Bringing such individuals together would be like assembling a collection of nuclear weapons and hoping they would achieve stable fusion rather than mutual annihilation. "And you want me to be part of this?" she asked, though the question was more about understanding her role than expressing doubt about the mission's importance. "I want you to be the glue that holds it together," Fury replied. "Your experience with psychological manipulation used for good this time could be crucial in managing personalities that aren't exactly designed for teamwork." The irony was not lost on her. The skills the Red Room had taught her for exploitation and control would now be employed to build trust and cooperation among individuals who had every reason to distrust each other. It was a challenge that appealed to her on multiple levels: intellectually stimulating, morally complex, and potentially crucial for the survival of everything she had learned to value. But it was also terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. The Avengers initiative would require her to work alongside individuals whose capabilities dwarfed her own, people who could reshape reality through sheer force of will or technological mastery. Her value to such a team would be entirely dependent on her ability to prove that human intelligence and experience could complement superhuman power. More personally, it would mean trusting and being trusted by people who represented everything she was still learning to become heroes in the truest sense of the word. Individuals who risked everything to protect strangers, without expectation of reward or recognition. The first team assembly was held in a S.H.I.E.L.D. facility that had been hastily retrofitted to accommodate the unique requirements of superpowered individuals. Security measures that would have been adequate for conventional intelligence operations seemed almost quaint when applied to people who could fly, phase through solid matter, or bench press aircraft carriers. Natasha arrived early, a habit developed during years of operational planning, and positioned herself where she could observe the team dynamics as they developed. The psychology of group formation was something the Red Room had studied extensively, and she applied those analytical skills to understanding how this unprecedented collection of individuals might function as a cohesive unit. Stark entered with the kind of theatrical flair that seemed calculated to establish dominance through sheer force of personality. His reputation preceded him: genius, inventor, weapons manufacturer turned peace activist, a man whose ego was matched only by his genuine desire to protect the world from threats, including himself. But Natasha could see beneath the performance to the insecurity and guilt that drove his messianic impulses. Rogers followed with the quiet dignity that had made him an effective symbol, even when he was a man out of time. His presence seemed to subtly alter the room's atmosphere, lending weight and seriousness to proceedings that might otherwise have devolved into posturing and competition. But she could also see the confusion and displacement that haunted him, the struggle of a man trying to find his place in a world that had moved beyond his understanding. Banner arrived last, his self-deprecating humor barely concealing the constant tension of someone who carried apocalyptic power within his own body. His psychological profile made for disturbing reading, a brilliant scientist whose research had transformed him into something that terrified him more than any external threat. Yet there was a gentleness to him that suggested the monster within was balanced by genuine compassion for humanity. Thor's arrival was postponed due to what Fury euphemistically called dimensional logistics issues, but his eventual integration into the team would represent challenges that none of them were yet prepared to address. The initial briefings focused on threat assessment and response protocols, technical subjects that allowed the team members to evaluate each other's capabilities, without requiring the kind of personal vulnerability that would be necessary for genuine trust. Natasha contributed intelligence summaries and tactical analyses, establishing her value as more than just another weapon in S.H.I.E.L.D's arsenal. But it was during the first simulated mission scenario that she truly understood both the potential and the dangers inherent in the Avengers concept. The exercise was designed to test their ability to coordinate responses to a theoretical terrorist attack involving both conventional weapons and exotic technology. On paper, it should have been straightforward: identify threats, neutralize hostile forces, minimize civilian casualties. In practice, it became a case study in how good intentions could create catastrophic unintended consequences. Stark's approach was to immediately deploy overwhelming technological superiority, using his armor's advanced sensors and weapons systems to dominate the battlefield through sheer firepower. It was effective but lacking in subtlety, the kind of solution that would work brilliantly until it encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by superior engineering. Rogers advocated for a more methodical approach, drawing on his military experience to develop tactical solutions that emphasized coordination and mutual support. His strategies were sound but sometimes failed to account for the unique capabilities that distinguished his teammates from conventional soldiers. Banner's reluctance to engage at all created complications that forced the others to compensate for what should have been an overwhelming advantage. His fear of the Hulk was so profound that he essentially removed himself from consideration as a tactical asset, leaving the team operating at reduced effectiveness. Natasha found herself serving as translator between these different approaches, using her psychological training to help each team member understand the other's perspectives while identifying ways their diverse capabilities could complement rather than compete with each other. The thing about teams, she observed during the post-exercise debriefing, is that they're only as strong as their weakest link, but they're also only as smart as their smartest member, only as fast as their fastest member, only as careful as their most cautious member. The trick is figuring out how to be all of those things simultaneously. It was a principle that would prove crucial as the Avengers evolved from theoretical framework to operational reality. Each member brought capabilities that could be decisive in the right circumstances. But those same capabilities could be liabilities if not properly integrated with the team's overall strategic approach. Natasha's role became that of psychological architect, helping to build the interpersonal relationships that would allow the team to function effectively under stress. She studied each member's motivations, fears, and triggers with the same analytical precision she had once applied to enemy agents. But now her goal was understanding rather than exploitation. Stark, she realized, needed to feel intellectually valued and strategically central to any operation. His ego was not mere vanity but a psychological defense mechanism that protected him from the guilt and self-doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. By ensuring that his contributions were acknowledged and his insights incorporated into mission planning, she could maintain his engagement while managing his tendency toward reckless grandstanding. Rogers required clear moral frameworks and definitive strategic objectives. His discomfort with moral ambiguity was not weakness, but a fundamental aspect of his character that had to be accommodated rather than challenged. By presenting mission parameters in terms that aligned with his ethical convictions, she could ensure his wholehearted commitment to team objectives. Banner needed constant reassurance that his participation was voluntary and that he retained the option to withdraw if circumstances became untenable. His relationship with the Hulk was so complex and traumatic that forcing his engagement would be counterproductive. Instead, she worked to create environments where he felt safe enough to contribute voluntarily, understanding that his willing cooperation was infinitely more valuable than his reluctant compliance. The process was exhausting and occasionally frustrating, requiring her to maintain awareness of multiple psychological dynamics simultaneously while contributing to actual mission objectives. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways that her previous work had never been. For the first time in her life, she was using her skills to build something rather than destroy it, to create trust rather than exploit vulnerabilities, to strengthen relationships rather than manipulate them for tactical advantage. The transformation from weapon to protector was not just professional, but profoundly personal. As the Avengers gradually evolved from a collection of exceptional individuals into something approaching a genuine team, Natasha began to understand that she had found more than just a new job or a different cause to serve. She had found a family dysfunctional, complicated, and occasionally infuriating, but genuine in ways that the Red Room's artificial relationships had never been. The realization both thrilled and terrified her, for it meant that she now had something to lose that was worth more than her own life. The message arrived through channels so deeply buried in the intelligence underground that its very existence seemed like a whisper from a graveyard. 3 words in Russian, encoded in a frequency pattern that had been obsolete for a decade. The daughter returns. To anyone else, it would have been meaningless static, background noise in the endless chatter of international espionage. But Natasha recognized it immediately as a death sentence dressed in the syntax of nostalgia. She was in her apartment overlooking the East River when the transmission reached her, watching the pre-dawn light paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and rose. The peaceful moment shattered like glass as the implications of the message crystallized in her mind. The Red Room, which she had allowed herself to believe was finished with her, had finally decided to collect on its investment. They were calling her home. The apartment that had become her sanctuary suddenly felt like a trap. Every shadow potentially concealing an assassin, every sound potentially announcing the arrival of agents trained in the same lethal techniques that had made her so formidable. But even as her tactical instincts screamed warnings about immediate danger, a deeper part of her psyche recoiled from something far more threatening than physical death. The possibility that everything she had become since her defection was about to be tested against everything she had been before. She reached for her secure phone to contact S.H.I.E.L.D, then hesitated as the full complexity of her situation became clear. How could she explain to Fury that the past she had tried to leave behind was actively hunting her? How could she ask her Avengers teammates to trust her when the organization that had created her was attempting to reclaim its property? More troubling still, how could she be certain that her defection was genuine rather than an elaborate long-term deception that even she had been convinced was real? The doubt that crept into her thoughts was like poison in her bloodstream, spreading through her consciousness and contaminating every memory of the past several years. Had her moral awakening been authentic, or was it simply another layer of conditioning designed to make her a more effective deep-cover operative? Had her relationships with Barton, Fury, and the other Avengers been genuine, or was she unconsciously manipulating them according to programming she didn't even realize she possessed? The questions multiplied with viral intensity, each one spawning a dozen more, until she found herself unable to trust even her own memories and motivations. This was the Red Room's true masterstroke, not just creating the perfect spy, but creating someone who could never be entirely certain that they had escaped the organization's influence. A soft knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and her hand moved automatically to the pistol concealed beneath her kitchen counter. But the knock came in a specific pattern, 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again, that identified the visitor as Clint Barton, using one of their predetermined recognition signals. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression of grim concern that told her he already knew about the message. How he had learned about it so quickly was a question for later. Right now, she was simply grateful for the presence of someone who understood the stakes involved. "We need to talk," he said simply, stepping into her apartment and immediately moving to check the windows for potential surveillance positions. Even in civilian clothes, his every movement carried the purposeful efficiency of someone prepared for violence. "How did you know?" she asked, accepting the coffee gratefully and noting that he had prepared it exactly the way she preferred, a small gesture that somehow carried enormous emotional weight. S.H.I.E.L.D monitors certain frequency ranges for coded transmissions, he replied, continuing his security sweep with professional thoroughness. "When something comes through in obsolete Soviet cipher patterns, we pay attention. When it's directed at one of our people, we pay very close attention." The phrase, "one of our people," hit her with unexpected force, reminding her that she was no longer isolated and alone as she had been for most of her life. Whatever the Red Room had planned, she would not have to face it without allies who were willing to risk themselves for her safety. But that realization brought its own burden of responsibility. Her past was not just her own problem, it was a threat to everyone she had learned to care about. "They're not going to give up," she said, settling into a chair positioned to maintain sightlines to all possible entry points. "The Red Room doesn't accept defections. They either reclaim their assets or they eliminate them as security threats." Barton finished his security check and joined her at the small dining table, his own positioning calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire should the apartment be breached. The automatic tactical coordination between them was both comforting and troubling evidence of how thoroughly their training had shaped their instincts. "So we make sure they can't do either," he said, with the quiet confidence that had made him such an effective partner. S.H.I.E.L.D. has resources they never imagined, and you're not the same person who walked out of their program. But even as he spoke the words of reassurance, Natasha could see the doubt in his eyes. He wanted to believe that her transformation was complete and irreversible, but he also understood the sophistication of Soviet psychological conditioning better than most intelligence professionals. The possibility that she might revert to her original programming under sufficient stress was something they both had to consider. "What if they're right?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since the message arrived. "What if everything I think I've become is just another cover identity, another role I've been programmed to play?" The question hung in the air between them like a live electrical wire, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Barton studied her face with the analytical attention of someone whose life had depended on reading human nature accurately, searching for signs of the person he had chosen to trust with his friendship and his secrets. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said finally. "But I don't think that's what this is. I've seen you make choices that went against your training, decisions that cost you tactically but were right morally. That's not programming, that's conscience." His faith in her authenticity was both touching and terrifying, for it placed an enormous burden of responsibility on her shoulders. If he was wrong, if her defection was indeed an elaborate deception, then his trust would be weaponized against everything he had sworn to protect. Over the following days, as S.H.I.E.L.D. mobilized its resources to counter whatever operation the Red Room was planning, Natasha found herself confronting the full complexity of her psychological situation. Every interaction with her colleagues became an exercise in self-examination. Every decision a test of whether her motivations were genuine or manufactured. The arrival of intel about other Red Room operatives being activated throughout the American intelligence community only deepened her sense of unease. The organization was clearly planning something significant, and her defection had apparently been the trigger for a much larger operation that had been years in the making. But it was the discovery of another defector, a woman calling herself Yelena Belova, who claimed to be another graduate of the Red Room program, that truly shattered her psychological equilibrium. Belova was everything Natasha might have been if she had remained loyal to her Soviet conditioning, ruthlessly efficient, emotionally detached, and absolutely convinced of the righteousness of her cause. But she was also something more disturbing, a mirror that reflected back not just Natasha's past, but a possible future where her defection was revealed as an elaborate deception. "You think you've escaped," Belova said during their first confrontation, her voice carrying the cold precision that Natasha remembered from her own early years. "You think you've become someone different, someone better. But you're still the same weapon they created, just pointed in a different direction." The accusation struck at the heart of Natasha's deepest fears about her own authenticity. Was she truly a reformed person who had chosen to serve a better cause? Or was she simply another tool being used by different masters for purposes she didn't fully understand? The question would haunt her for years to come, a psychological shadow that would influence every relationship and every decision. But in that moment, facing another product of the Red Room's conditioning, she made a choice that would define the rest of her existence. She would act as if her transformation was real, as if her conscience was genuine, as if her relationships with her colleagues were authentic rather than calculated. And she would continue making that choice every day, regardless of her doubts, until either the evidence proved her wrong or she became the person she was choosing to be through the very act of choosing. It was, she realized, what Clint had been trying to tell her from the beginning. Identity was not something imposed by others or predetermined by conditioning. It was something created through the accumulation of choices, each one building on the last, until they formed a structure solid enough to support a genuine life. The Red Room had created Black Widow, but Natasha Romanoff would create herself. The revelation of her capacity for genuine human connection came not through dramatic confrontation or philosophical epiphany, but through the quiet accumulation of moments that seemed almost insignificant individually but were profound in their collective impact. It was Clint teaching her to make coffee the way his ex-wife had preferred it, not because he expected her to like it, but because sharing the ritual felt like an act of trust. It was Tony Stark, casually mentioning that he had upgraded her apartment's security system because nobody should have to sleep with one eye open, then pretending the gesture was motivated by technological curiosity rather than genuine concern for her well-being. It was the way Steve Rogers always positioned himself between her and potential threats during team meetings, not because he doubted her ability to protect herself, but because his protective instincts operated at a level deeper than conscious thought. It was Bruce Banner seeking her out for conversations about books and music, finding in her analytical mind a refuge from the chaos that ruled his own psychological landscape. But perhaps most significantly, it was the gradual recognition that these relationships had become necessary to her in ways that transcended operational utility or strategic advantage. For someone who had been conditioned to see every human interaction as a transaction with calculable costs and benefits, the discovery that she genuinely cared about people, not for what they could provide her, but for who they were as individuals, represented a transformation so fundamental that it challenged her entire understanding of her own nature. The realization crystallized during what should have been a routine debriefing session following a mission in Budapest. The operation had gone smoothly by any objective standard objectives achieved. Minimal collateral damage. All team members returning safely to base. But Clint had been injured during the extraction. Nothing life-threatening but serious enough to require medical attention. And Natasha found herself experiencing an emotional response that her Red Room training had specifically been designed to eliminate. She was afraid, not strategically concerned about losing a valuable tactical asset, not professionally worried about the operational implications of his temporary incapacitation, but genuinely, personally terrified at the possibility of losing someone who had become irreplaceable to her psychological well-being. The fear was irrational, counterproductive, and completely authentic, everything the Red Room had worked to excise from her emotional repertoire. And yet, as she sat in the medical bay watching Clint receive treatment for a shrapnel wound that would heal completely within weeks, she recognized that this irrational fear was also the most human thing she had experienced since her defection. "You know," Clint said, noticing her expression as the medical team finished their work. "For someone who's supposed to be a master of emotional manipulation, you're terrible at hiding what you're feeling right now." She started to deny the observation, to deploy one of the dozens of deflection techniques that had become second nature during her years of covert operations. But something in his expression, amusement mixed with genuine affection, made her recognize that honesty might be more valuable than professional composure. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in her mouth. "I don't know how to care about people without calculating what their loss would cost me." It was a confession that revealed the fundamental challenge of her transformation from weapon to person. The Red Room had taught her to analyze every relationship in terms of strategic value, to maintain emotional distance that would allow her to sacrifice anyone if circumstances required it. But the bonds she had formed with her S.H.I.E.L.D. colleagues and Avengers teammates had somehow transcended those calculations, creating vulnerabilities that she didn't know how to manage. "Maybe that's the point," Clint replied, his voice carrying the gentle wisdom that had made him such an effective handler of damaged people. "Maybe caring about people isn't supposed to be calculated. Maybe it's supposed to be messy and irrational and terrifying because that's what makes it real." The conversation continued as they made their way back to S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, touching on subjects that would have been unthinkable for Natasha to discuss just a few years earlier. The nature of friendship, the distinction between love and tactical attachment, the possibility that vulnerability might be a source of strength rather than weakness. It was during this conversation that Clint mentioned his family for the first time, not in detail, not with specific information that could compromise their security, but with the kind of casual reference that indicated a level of trust she had never expected to receive from anyone. "Laura always said that the most dangerous people are the ones who have nothing left to lose," he observed as they walked through the corridors of the Triskelion. "But I think she was wrong about that. The most dangerous people are the ones who have everything to lose and are willing to risk it anyway." The comment sparked a series of realizations that would reshape her understanding of her own motivations and capabilities. She had spent years believing that her emotional detachment made her more effective as an operative, that the absence of personal attachments eliminated potential weaknesses that enemies could exploit. But her relationships with the Avengers had actually made her more formidable, not less. Caring about her teammates' safety made her more tactical in her approach to dangerous situations. Understanding their psychological needs made her better at coordinating team efforts. Having something worth protecting gave her a clarity of purpose that had been absent during her years as a Soviet asset. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying, for it meant acknowledging that she had become someone fundamentally different from the Black Widow who had been forged in the Red Room's psychological furnaces. But it also meant accepting that she now carried responsibilities that extended far beyond her own survival or mission success. Her relationship with Tony Stark evolved along different lines, characterized by intellectual sparring and mutual recognition of shared burdens. Both of them carried guilt from their past actions, his from weapons that had killed innocents, hers from lives she had taken in service to a cause she no longer believed in. But where Tony's guilt manifested as messianic compulsions to save the world through technology, hers expressed itself as a careful dedication to protecting the relationships she had finally learned to value. Their conversations often took place in his workshop, where the ambient noise of machinery and the comfortable chaos of ongoing projects created an environment where serious discussions could unfold without the formal weight of official debriefings. Tony would tinker with some incomprehensible device while she performed equipment maintenance, both of them working with their hands while their minds engaged with problems that had no clear solutions. "The thing about having a dark past," Tony observed during one such session, not looking up from the arc reactor component he was calibrating, "is that it never really goes away. You can build all the suits you want, save all the people you can find, but the scoreboard never resets to zero." Natasha paused in her inspection of a communications device, recognizing the observation as more than casual philosophy. "So why do we keep trying?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on their shared struggle for redemption. "Because the alternative is giving up," he replied, finally meeting her eyes with an expression of surprising vulnerability. "And giving up means admitting that we're exactly what our worst enemies say we are, that people like us can't change, can't grow, can't become something better than what we started as." It was a sentiment that resonated deeply with her own experience of transformation. The Red Room had created her to be a weapon, and for years she had accepted that definition as the totality of her identity. But her relationships with the Avengers had shown her that identity was not fixed, that people could choose to become something different from what others expected them to be. Her connection with Bruce Banner developed along yet another trajectory, built on their shared understanding of what it meant to carry something dangerous within oneself. Bruce's relationship with the Hulk was obviously more dramatic than her own struggle with Red Room conditioning, but the fundamental challenge was similar: learning to live with aspects of yourself that had been imposed by others, that didn't represent your chosen identity but couldn't be completely eliminated. "The hardest part," Bruce told her during one of their quiet conversations in the Avengers' common area, "isn't controlling the monster. It's accepting that the monster is part of me now, that I can't just cut it out and go back to being who I was before." She understood exactly what he meant. The skills and instincts that the Red Room had built into her psychology couldn't be simply discarded. They were too deeply integrated into her nervous system and thought patterns. But they could be redirected, channeled toward purposes that aligned with her chosen values, rather than her imposed programming. "Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate it," she suggested, drawing on insights from her own experience of psychological reconstruction. "Maybe it's to transform the relationship, to become the one who controls rather than the one who's controlled." Their discussions often centered on practical strategies for managing dangerous aspects of their own psychology, meditation techniques that Bruce had developed to maintain emotional equilibrium, tactical exercises that Natasha used to keep her reflexes sharp, while ensuring they served protective rather than destructive purposes. But perhaps the most complex relationship in her new constellation of connections was the one she developed with Steve Rogers, a man who represented everything the Red Room had taught her to despise about American idealism, while simultaneously embodying virtues that her emerging conscience recognized as genuinely admirable. Steve's unwavering moral certainty was initially frustrating to someone whose entire worldview had been built on the assumption that ethical compromises were not just inevitable, but necessary for effective action. His belief that right and wrong could be clearly distinguished seemed naively simplistic to someone who had spent years navigating the moral ambiguities of intelligence work. But gradually, she began to recognize that his moral clarity was not simplicity, but sophistication, the result of someone who had thought deeply about ethical questions and arrived at principles he was willing to defend regardless of personal cost. His idealism was not naive but battle-tested, forged in the crucible of actual combat against forces that represented genuine evil. More importantly, he treated her with the same respect and trust he extended to teammates who had never betrayed anyone, never killed innocent people, never served causes they later recognized as fundamentally wrong. His faith in her capacity for redemption was absolute and apparently unshakable, based not on ignorance of her past, but on his conviction that people could choose to become better than they had been. The thing about second chances, he told her during a training session that had evolved into something approaching philosophical discussion, is that they're not really about forgetting the past. They're about proving that the past doesn't have to define the future. It was a perspective that freed her from the burden of perfect redemption, the impossible expectation that she could somehow balance the scales by performing enough good deeds to offset her previous actions. Instead, it suggested that redemption was an ongoing process, a series of choices made daily to serve something larger and better than her own immediate interests. The web of relationships that surrounded her grew more complex as her integration into the superhero community deepened. Her connection with Nick Fury evolved from professional collaboration to something approaching parental guidance, with the gruff spy master serving as both mentor and reality check for someone still learning to navigate the moral complexities of hero work. Maria Hill became not just a colleague but a friend whose own dedication to protecting innocent people provided a model for how intelligence work could serve genuinely noble purposes. Phil Coulson's quiet competence and unflappable professionalism taught her that heroism didn't always require dramatic gestures. Sometimes it was enough to do your job well and care about the people depending on you. But it was the gradual recognition that these relationships had become reciprocal that truly marked her complete transformation from weapon to person. She was not just receiving support and guidance from her colleagues, she was providing it in return, using her hard-won insights to help them navigate their own challenges and conflicts. When Tony struggled with the guilt and responsibility that came with his technology being used for destructive purposes, she helped him understand that intention mattered more than outcome, that he couldn't control every use of his inventions, but could control his response to misuse. When Steve felt overwhelmed by the moral complexities of modern warfare and international politics, she provided perspective from someone who had operated in those gray areas for years, helping him understand that moral clarity didn't require moral simplicity. When Bruce battled with self-doubt about his place on the team and his ability to control the Hulk, she shared strategies for managing dangerous aspects of one's own psychology, techniques developed through her own struggle to integrate Red Room conditioning with chosen values. When Clint worried about the impact of his dangerous work on his family relationships, she helped him understand that love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting people meant accepting the risk of losing them. The realization that she had become someone others could depend on, not just for tactical support, but for emotional guidance and psychological stability, marked the completion of a transformation that had begun in a warehouse in Queens years earlier. She was no longer just a reformed villain seeking redemption. She was a fully realized person, with her own wisdom to offer, her own contributions to make to the collective well-being of the people she had learned to love. The Black Widow had been a weapon wielded by others, Natasha Romanoff had become someone who chose her own battles and fought for causes that reflected her own moral convictions. But perhaps most importantly, she had become someone who understood that the strongest people were not those who needed nothing from others, but those who could both give and receive support as part of a community united by shared values and mutual commitment. In the end, the web of relationships that surrounded her was not a source of vulnerability to be managed, but a source of strength to be treasured, the foundation upon which everything else she would accomplish would be built. The Sokovia Accords arrived like a funeral shroud over the Avengers compound, 117 pages of legal text that represented the international community's attempt to impose governmental oversight on individuals whose power had begun to rival that of nation-states. For Natasha, reading through the document's carefully crafted language was like revisiting a nightmare she thought she had escaped: the reduction of human beings to strategic assets, the subordination of individual conscience to institutional authority, the transformation of heroes into weapons to be deployed at the discretion of political masters. Yet she found herself in the unprecedented position of supporting the Accords, not because she believed in the righteousness of governmental control, but because she understood better than most of her teammates the catastrophic consequences that could result from unchecked power operating without accountability. The irony was exquisite and painful. She, who had spent years as a weapon wielded by the Soviet state, was now arguing for the necessity of submitting to political oversight. She, who had fought so hard to achieve the right to make her own moral choices, was advocating for a system that would limit the Avengers' ability to act according to their individual consciences. But her support for the Accords was not a betrayal of her hard-won independence. It was the product of that independence, a decision made through careful analysis of competing values and potential consequences rather than reflexive opposition to authority. The debate that consumed the team in the weeks following the Accords presentation revealed fault lines that had been developing for years, philosophical differences that had been masked by their shared commitment to protecting innocent people. When those differences were finally exposed, they proved to be far more fundamental than anyone had anticipated. Steve Rogers opposed the Accords with the passionate conviction of someone who had witnessed firsthand what happened when good people abdicated moral responsibility to institutions that were not inherently moral. His experience with Hydra's infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D. had taught him that organizations could be corrupted while individuals retained their ethical compass, and he was unwilling to surrender his team's autonomy to systems that might be compromised or co-opted. Governments are run by people with agendas, he argued during one of their increasingly heated discussions, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen democracy's failures as well as its successes. And agendas change. What happens when someone decides that the Avengers are a threat to be neutralized rather than an asset to be deployed? Tony Stark supported the Accords with the fervor of someone seeking redemption through accountability, convinced that their team's mistakes could be minimized through proper oversight and coordination with legitimate authorities. His guilt over Ultron's creation and the devastation in Sokovia had left him desperate for external validation that their actions served the greater good, rather than merely satisfying their own heroic impulses. "We need to be put in check," he insisted, his usual wit replaced by an intensity that bordered on self-flagellation. "We have power that can reshape the world, and we've been using it without any meaningful oversight. That's not heroism, that's vigilantism, with better press coverage." The philosophical divide between them was unbridgeable, rooted in fundamentally different beliefs about the relationship between individual conscience and collective authority. Steve's opposition to the Accords was based on his conviction that moral individuals could be trusted to make ethical decisions without external coercion. Tony's support was founded on his belief that even well-intentioned people needed institutional constraints to prevent their good intentions from causing catastrophic harm. Natasha found herself caught between these perspectives, understanding the validity of both arguments while recognizing that the team's unity was being sacrificed to principles that neither side was willing to compromise. Her position in support of the Accords was not born of philosophical conviction, but of pragmatic calculation. The recognition that fighting the international community's desire for oversight would ultimately prove more destructive than accepting reasonable limitations on their autonomy. But her support was also strategic in ways that her teammates did not fully understand. She had learned during her years in the intelligence community that the most effective way to subvert unwanted authority was to appear to comply while maintaining operational flexibility through careful interpretation of restrictions. The Accords could be managed, their limitations circumvented when necessary, their oversight mechanisms manipulated to serve the team's actual objectives. It was a perspective born of years spent navigating authoritarian systems, and it required a level of moral flexibility that some of her teammates found deeply troubling. Steve, in particular, viewed her willingness to accept the Accords as a betrayal of the principles they had fought to defend, a return to the kind of institutional loyalty that had characterized her years as a Soviet asset. "I thought you understood better than anyone what it means to be controlled by people who don't share your values," he said during a private conversation that felt more like an interrogation than a discussion between friends. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Her support for the Accords did represent a form of accommodation, with authority that echoed her years of service to the Soviet state. But it also reflected hard-won wisdom about the reality of operating in a world where ideological purity was a luxury that few people could afford. "I understand exactly what it means," she replied, her voice carrying a coldness that surprised them both. "I also understand what it means to fight a war you can't win, to sacrifice everything for principles that nobody else shares, to end up isolated and powerless because you refuse to accept imperfect solutions to complex problems." The conversation revealed the fundamental difference in their approaches to moral compromise. Steve saw any accommodation with unjust authority as a betrayal of conscience, while Natasha viewed strategic compromise as a tool for achieving long-term objectives that might otherwise be impossible to accomplish. The schism became irreparable when the Winter Soldier situation forced them to choose between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to individuals. Steve's decision to protect Bucky Barnes, regardless of the legal and political consequences, represented everything Natasha had learned to value about his character: his unwavering commitment to the people he cared about, his refusal to sacrifice individuals for abstract principles. But it also represented everything that made him potentially dangerous as a leader in the modern world: his willingness to prioritize personal loyalty over collective responsibility, his inability to accept that sometimes good people had to make terrible choices for the greater good. When the situation escalated into actual conflict between the Avengers, Natasha found herself forced to make a choice that would haunt her for years to come. Standing in that bunker in Siberia, watching Steve and Tony tear each other apart both literally and figuratively, she realized that her decision to support the Accords had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The oversight she had hoped would provide stability and legitimacy had instead become a weapon used to divide the team against itself. The institutional authority she had thought could be managed and circumvented had proven more rigid and destructive than she had anticipated. Most painfully of all, her attempt to find a middle ground between competing principles had satisfied no one and had ultimately contributed to the destruction of the relationships she valued most. In the aftermath of the conflict, with the team scattered and the Accords serving as a barrier rather than a bridge between the Avengers and the world they had sworn to protect, Natasha was forced to confront the limitations of her own tactical approach to moral questions. Some problems could not be solved through strategic thinking or careful compromise. Some choices required accepting significant losses in service of principles that transcended immediate practical considerations. Her decision to eventually help Steve and Bucky escape represented more than just a tactical shift. It was an acknowledgement that her relationships with her teammates were more important than her commitment to institutional stability. The bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual trust were stronger than any legal framework, more reliable than any governmental oversight. But it was also an admission that her approach to the Accords crisis had been fundamentally flawed. In trying to serve both her conscience and her strategic assessment of political reality, she had ultimately served neither effectively. The attempt to maintain her position on both sides of an irreconcilable conflict had left her isolated and ineffective when decisive action was most needed. The lesson was harsh but necessary. Some situations required choosing a side and accepting the consequences of that choice, regardless of the tactical disadvantages or strategic costs involved. Moral clarity sometimes demanded moral courage, especially when the price of that courage was higher than anyone wanted to pay. As she stood in the shadows watching Steve and Bucky disappear into the darkness of an uncertain future, Natasha understood that she had learned something crucial about the nature of heroism. It was not about finding the perfect solution that satisfied everyone's needs and concerns. It was about choosing what was right, even when that choice guaranteed loss, even when it meant accepting responsibility for consequences that could never be fully predicted or controlled. The Civil War had ended, but the real battle, the one for the soul of what the Avengers represented, was just beginning. And this time, she would not try to stand in the middle. She would choose her side and fight for it, with everything she had learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the terrible necessity of doing what was right rather than what was safe. The name Dreykov arrived in a classified S.H.I.E.L.D. intelligence briefing. Like a ghost materializing from a nightmare she thought she had finally escaped. General Dreykov, architect of the Red Room, creator of the Widow program, the man who had overseen her transformation from nameless child into the Soviet Union's most lethal weapon. According to every official record, he had died in Budapest 15 years earlier, killed in an explosion that had also claimed his young daughter's life. The mission that had eliminated him was one of the few operations from her Soviet days that Natasha had never regretted, considering it a necessary step in dismantling the program that had created her. But intelligence reports were now suggesting that Dreykov's death had been carefully staged, that he had survived the Budapest explosion and had spent the intervening years rebuilding the Red Room program with resources and technology that far exceeded anything the original Soviet operation had possessed. More troubling still, the new Red Room was apparently creating widows through chemical subjugation rather than psychological conditioning, producing assassins who retained their free will until activated by airborne pheromone triggers that turned them into perfect killing machines. The implications were staggering. If Dreykov had indeed survived, if he had perfected the techniques that the original Red Room had only begun to explore, then there could be hundreds or even thousands of widows operating throughout the world, ordinary women living normal lives until they received the chemical signal that transformed them into unconscious agents of a shadow organization with unknown objectives. Natasha stood before the wall-mounted displays in the secure briefing room, studying satellite images of facilities in remote locations across Eastern Europe that bore the architectural signatures of Red Room installations. Each photograph represented a potential site where young women were being processed through updated versions of the program that had stolen her own childhood, and the knowledge burned in her chest like swallowed acid. "The question," said Maria Hill, whose calm professionalism barely concealed her obvious concern about the strategic implications of the intelligence, "is whether this represents a direct threat to current operations or if it's primarily about settling old scores." It was a fair question, one that went to the heart of Natasha's complicated relationship with her own past. From an operational standpoint, a resurgent Red Room represented a significant threat to international stability, a rogue intelligence network with the capability to place assets in positions of influence throughout the global community. But from a personal standpoint, it represented something far more complex, an opportunity to complete the work she had begun with her own defection, to free other women from the psychological slavery that had defined her early life. "It's both," she replied, her voice carrying the precise diction that emerged whenever she was processing information with the analytical detachment that Red Room training had burned into her cognitive processes. Dreykov didn't rebuild the program just to settle personal grievances. He's positioning himself to become a major player in the post-Cold War intelligence landscape, and chemical mind control gives him capabilities that traditional espionage networks can't match. The briefing continued with technical assessments of the new program's apparent capabilities, psychological profiles of potential targets, and strategic recommendations for countering the threat. But Natasha found her attention drifting to more personal considerations. The knowledge that her sister widows were still trapped in updated versions of the system she had escaped, still being used as weapons by a man who had never seen them as anything more than valuable property. The decision to pursue the investigation personally rather than through official S.H.I.E.L.D. channels was not made lightly. She understood the risks involved in confronting Dreykov directly, both to herself and to the people who had come to depend on her as part of their operational community. But she also understood that this was work that could not be delegated to others, a responsibility that fell to her specifically because of her unique understanding of the Red Room's methods and psychology. Yelena Belova's unexpected appearance at her apartment 3 days later confirmed that the situation was more complex and dangerous than even the intelligence reports had suggested. The woman who stood in her doorway was simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizably another product of the Red Room program, but carrying herself with a kind of casual confidence that suggested she had somehow escaped the psychological damage that had taken Natasha years to overcome. "Hello, sister," Yelena said, the Russian endearment carrying undertones of both affection and challenge. "I think it's time we had a conversation about family business." The woman who entered Natasha's apartment was everything she might have been if the Red Room's conditioning had been less thorough, or if her defection had occurred earlier in her psychological development. Yelena possessed the same lethal skills and analytical intelligence, but she also retained a sense of humor and emotional spontaneity that the original program had systematically eliminated from its graduates. More importantly, she carried information about the current Red Room operation that confirmed Natasha's worst fears about Dreykov's survival and expansion of the program. The chemical mind control was not just a refinement of existing techniques, but a complete reimagining of how human beings could be weaponized while retaining the appearance of normal psychological function. "They don't even know they're widows until activation," Yelena explained as they sat in Natasha's kitchen, drinking tea prepared in the Russian style that had become a kind of cultural signature for both of them. "They live completely normal lives. Teachers, nurses, government clerks, corporate executives, until they receive the pheromone trigger. Then they become perfect killing machines for exactly as long as the mission requires, and afterward they return to their normal lives with no memory of what they've done." The sophistication of the system was both impressive and horrifying. Where the original Red Room had required years of intensive conditioning to produce a single operative, the new program could create functional assets in a matter of weeks, while maintaining perfect operational security through the subject's own unconscious cooperation. But the system also had vulnerabilities that the original program had lacked. The chemical basis of the control meant that it could potentially be countered by other chemicals, and the subject's retention of their basic personalities meant that the right kind of intervention might be able to break the conditioning entirely. "There's an antidote," Yelena continued, producing a small vial of clear liquid from her jacket pocket. "Synthetic red dust that neutralizes the pheromone control and restores the subject's awareness of their situation. The problem is getting close enough to administer it without triggering their defensive programming." The implications were staggering. If the antidote was effective, it might be possible to free not just individual widows, but potentially the entire network of chemical assets that Dreykov had created. But doing so would require infiltrating the heart of the Red Room operation and confronting the man who had been responsible for decades of systematic human rights violations. The mission that followed was unlike anything Natasha had attempted since her defection, where her work with S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers had been characterized by clear moral objectives and reliable support structures. The assault on Dreykov's operation required her to operate in the kind of moral ambiguity that had defined her Soviet years. The Red Room facility, hidden in the mountains of Belarus, was a monument to Dreykov's megalomania, a high-tech fortress disguised as a research institute where young women were processed through updated versions of the program that had created both Natasha and Yelena. But it was also a prison where dozens of completed widows were held in chemical stasis, waiting to be deployed against targets throughout the world. The infiltration required every skill that years of espionage training had developed, but it also demanded emotional resilience that pushed her to the limits of her psychological endurance. Moving through corridors where she could hear the sounds of conditioning sessions in progress, seeing rooms filled with the apparatus used to break down and rebuild human personalities, confronting the systematic industrialization of the trauma that had shaped her own identity, All of it combined to create a psychological assault that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained emotional stability. But it was the confrontation with Dreykov himself that truly tested everything she had become since her defection. The man who had overseen her transformation from child to weapon was older now, his hair gone completely gray, and his face marked by the years he had spent rebuilding his empire in exile. But his eyes retained the cold calculation that had made him so effective at reducing human beings to their strategic utility. "Natasha Romanoff," he said as she entered his office with weapons drawn and escape routes calculated, his voice carrying the same paternal tone that had once made her desperate for his approval. "My greatest success and my most disappointing failure, returning home at last." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, with Dreykov attempting to reactivate conditioning that had been dormant for decades, while Natasha fought to maintain her sense of self against techniques that had once been irresistible. He reminded her of the skills he had given her, the purpose he had provided, the family he had created for her among the other widows. But he also revealed the true scope of his current operation, not just the chemical widows, but a global network of influence that extended into governments, corporations, and international organizations. The Red Room had evolved from a Soviet intelligence asset into something far more dangerous, a private military company with the capability to manipulate world events through the strategic deployment of unconscious assets. "You could have ruled the world," he told her, his voice carrying genuine regret for opportunities that had been lost through her defection. "Instead, you chose to serve masters who will never fully trust you, who see you as a reformed villain rather than a genuine hero." It was an accusation that struck at her deepest insecurities about her place in the hero community, but it was also a reminder of how completely she had transcended the limitations that the Red Room had tried to impose on her identity. She was no longer the weapon he had created, no longer defined by the purposes others had chosen for her. The liberation of the chemical widows required a combination of tactical precision and emotional courage that drew on every aspect of her training and experience. Using Yelena's antidote, she was able to break the conditioning of dozens of women who had been trapped in chemical slavery, watching as they experienced the same kind of psychological awakening that had marked her own journey toward authentic selfhood. But the mission's success came at a cost that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Dreykov's death was necessary to prevent him from rebuilding the program elsewhere, but it also meant accepting responsibility for ending the life of someone who had shaped her own existence in fundamental ways. The man was a monster who had caused immeasurable suffering, but he was also the closest thing to a father figure that her manufactured memories contained. The explosion that finally destroyed the Red Room facility was visible from dozens of miles away, a pillar of fire and smoke that marked the end of an organization that had traumatized countless women across several generations. But as Natasha watched the flames consume the building, where she had been transformed from child to weapon, she understood that the real victory was not the destruction of the facility, but the liberation of the women who would now have the opportunity to choose their own paths. The widows, who had been freed from chemical conditioning, faced the same kind of identity crisis that had marked her own journey toward authentic selfhood. Some chose to disappear into civilian life, using skills that had been forced upon them to build new identities in places where their past could not follow them. Others, like Yelena, chose to continue the work of dismantling the networks and systems that had created them. But all of them faced the fundamental challenge that had defined Natasha's own transformation: learning to distinguish between the person they had been made to be and the person they chose to become. It was work that would take years, work that would require support and understanding from people who might never fully comprehend the complexity of their psychological situation. As she stood in the wreckage of her own origins, surrounded by women who were beginning their own journeys toward freedom, Natasha understood that she had completed more than just a mission. She had closed a circle that had been opened decades earlier in a warehouse in Queens, fulfilling the promise that her defection had represented not just to escape the Red Room's influence, but to ensure that others would have the same opportunity. The Black Widow program was finished, but the work of helping its survivors become whoever they chose to be was just beginning. The snap happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Wakanda, while Natasha was coordinating evacuation efforts for civilians caught in the crossfire of humanity's last desperate stand against Thanos and his army. One moment, she was speaking into her comm unit, directing medical teams toward wounded civilians who needed immediate extraction. The next moment, half of those civilians were simply gone, their bodies dissolving into ash that scattered on the wind like gray snow falling upward into an indifferent sky. The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not the tactical silence of a stealth operation or the emotional silence of psychological isolation, but the profound quiet of a world that had just lost half of its voices. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the planet itself was struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. Steve Rogers' voice crackled through her earpiece, hollow and distant despite the advanced technology that connected them across continents. "Natasha, are you there? We need a head count on who's left." The head count, when it was finally completed, read like a casualty report from humanity's worst nightmare. Half the Avengers, gone. Billions of civilians, gone. Governments, infrastructure, families, all of it reduced by exactly 50%, with the mathematical precision that characterized everything about the Mad Titan's genocidal philosophy. But for Natasha, the numbers were just abstractions compared to the personal losses that cut through her consciousness like shrapnel from an emotional explosion. Clint was gone, not dead, but something potentially worse, having witnessed his entire family dissolve into nothing while he was powerless to protect them. The man who had believed in her capacity for redemption, who had chosen to see humanity in someone who had been designed to be a weapon, had been broken by a loss so profound that it had transformed him into something she barely recognized. The 5 years that followed the snap were unlike anything in human history. Governments collapsed not from external pressure, but from the simple impossibility of maintaining infrastructure designed for twice as many people. Economic systems built on assumptions of steady growth and resource consumption had to be completely reimagined. Social structures that depended on extended families and community networks were shattered by random losses that followed no pattern except the cruel mathematics of perfectly random selection. But for the surviving Avengers, the challenge was more personal and perhaps more devastating than the macro-level changes reshaping civilization. They had to learn to live with the knowledge that they had failed at the moment when failure meant the erasure of half of everything they had sworn to protect. Natasha found herself serving as the team's de facto leader during those years, not because she had sought the position, but because someone had to hold the fractured pieces together, while the others struggled with their own forms of psychological collapse. Tony retreated into obsessive technological projects, desperately seeking solutions to problems that might not have solutions. Steve channeled his grief into support group leadership, trying to help other survivors process losses that defied comprehension. Bruce threw himself into scientific research, searching for theoretical frameworks that might explain what had happened and how it might be reversed. But it was Natasha who maintained the daily operations that kept the Avengers functioning as something more than a collection of traumatized individuals. She coordinated intelligence-gathering efforts to track global threats that continued to emerge, despite or because of the snap's aftermath. She managed the logistics of maintaining the compound and supporting the surviving team members. Most importantly, she refused to accept that their failure was permanent, continuing to pursue any lead that might suggest a path toward reversing what Thanos had accomplished. The work was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical demands. Every day required her to project confidence she didn't feel, to maintain hope she wasn't sure was justified, to provide leadership for people who had lost faith in their own effectiveness. It was a different kind of conditioning than what she had experienced in the Red Room, but conditioning nonetheless, the daily practice of being someone stronger and more certain than she actually felt. Her relationship with the remaining team members evolved in ways that reflected the impossible circumstances they were navigating together. Tony's guilt over their failure manifested as a kind of desperate intensity that made him difficult to be around for extended periods. But she understood that his obsessive project work was his way of maintaining sanity in a situation that defied rational response. Steve's dedication to helping other survivors process their grief was both admirable and heartbreaking, representing his continued commitment to serving others even when his own foundations had been shattered. but she could see the cost of that service in his eyes. The gradual erosion of the optimism that had defined his character since his emergence from the ice. Bruce's scientific approach to understanding the snap was methodical and thorough, but it was also a form of psychological defense against accepting the reality of their situation. As long as he could frame what had happened as a problem to be solved, rather than a tragedy to be endured, he could maintain the illusion that their failure was temporary rather than definitive. But it was her own psychological evolution during those 5 years that surprised her most. The woman who had once been designed to feel nothing had become someone who felt everything, not just her own grief and guilt, but the emotional weight of everyone depending on her to hold their fractured world together. The discovery of a potential solution came through the convergence of quantum mechanics and desperate hope, theoretical possibilities that might allow them to retrieve the Infinity Stones from alternative timelines and undo Thanos' work. It was a plan that violated every principle of temporal mechanics and had approximately equal chances of saving the universe or destroying it entirely. But it was also the only plan they had, and after 5 years of living with the consequences of their failure, even a minimal chance of success was worth risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The preparation for the time heist required her to confront memories and relationships that she had thought were safely buried in her past. Returning to the events surrounding the formation of the Avengers meant revisiting the psychological state she had been in during those early days, the uncertainty about her place on the team, the ongoing questions about her capacity for genuine loyalty, the gradual recognition that she had found something worth dying to protect. But the mission also required her to work alongside versions of her teammates who had not yet experienced the losses that would define their later years. Seeing Tony's cockiness before it was tempered by repeated failures, witnessing Steve's confidence before it was tested by impossible choices, observing Bruce's comfort with his dual nature before it was complicated by years of self-doubt. All of it reminded her of how much they had all changed, how much they had all lost even before the snap. The revelation that retrieving the Soul Stone would require a sacrifice that none of them were prepared to make transformed the mission from a desperate gamble into something approaching a suicide operation. Standing on Vormir with Clint, looking out over the cliff that would claim one of their lives in exchange for the stone that might save everyone else, Natasha understood that she had finally arrived at the moment that would define everything she had become since her defection from the Red Room. The argument with Clint over who would make the sacrifice was both heartbreaking and inevitable. Each of them absolutely convinced that their own life was worth less than the others, each determined to be the one who paid the price for humanity's salvation. But beneath the tactical arguments and emotional appeals was a deeper question about the nature of redemption and the possibility of balancing scales that had been weighted with decades of guilt and regret. "Let me go," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised them both. "It's okay. It's okay." The choice was not made from despair or self-hatred, but from a clear-eyed assessment of their relative value to the people who would survive to build whatever came next. Clint had a family to return to, people who depended on him for reasons that had nothing to do with his tactical capabilities or strategic importance. She had become someone who mattered to her teammates, but her relationships were primarily professional rather than personal, based on shared objectives rather than unconditional love. More importantly, she had finally found a way to complete the redemption that had begun in a warehouse in Queens decades earlier. Not through accumulating heroic deeds or performing enough good acts to balance the scales of her past, but through a single choice that would ensure the salvation of everyone she had learned to value above her own survival. The fall seemed to last forever, and no time at all. A moment of absolute clarity in which she understood that she had become exactly who she had chosen to be, not the weapon that the Red Room had designed, not the reformed villain that her early S.H.I.E.L.D. colleagues had expected, but someone who could make the ultimate sacrifice without hesitation because she had finally learned to value something more than her own existence. The impact was immediate and final, but the consequences of her choice would ripple through time and space in ways that she would never see. The Soul Stone that her sacrifice obtained would make possible the reversal of the snap, the restoration of half the universe's population, the return of everyone who had been lost to Thanos' genocidal mathematics. But more than that, her sacrifice would stand as proof that redemption was not just possible, but achievable, that people could transcend their origins and become something greater than what they had been designed to be. The Black Widow had been created to serve the interests of others without regard for her own welfare, but Natasha Romanoff had chosen to sacrifice herself for causes and people that she had selected according to her own moral convictions. In the end, the difference between those two identities, between imposed purpose and chosen meaning, was everything that mattered about what it meant to be human, rather than merely functional. The funeral was held on a gray afternoon, when even the autumn light seemed subdued, as if the world itself was mourning the loss of someone who had spent years learning to value life precisely because she understood how easily it could be taken. There was no body to bury that had been lost to the cosmic mechanics of the Soul Stone's requirements, but there was a need among those who had known her to mark the passage of someone who had transcended everything that had been expected of her. Yelena Belova stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the assembled heroes and dignitaries pay their respects to a woman whose true story could never be fully told in public forums. The sanitized version of Natasha's life that was presented to the world focused on her heroic deeds and noble sacrifice, carefully omitting the decades of violence and manipulation that had preceded her transformation. But Yelena knew the complete narrative, and she understood that the omitted chapters were crucial to understanding what made the conclusions so remarkable. The woman being eulogized had not been born a hero. She had been manufactured as a weapon, conditioned to kill without conscience, programmed to serve masters who saw her as property rather than a person. That she had transcended those origins, that she had learned to choose her own battles and fight for causes that reflected her own moral convictions. That was the real story, the one that would never be told at state funerals or commemorated in official histories. But it was also the story that mattered most to the people whose lives she had touched during her journey from weapon to woman to hero. Each of them carried pieces of her transformation within their own memories, fragments of conversations and shared experiences that revealed aspects of her character that the public would never see. Clint Barton spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed her complete psychological evolution from the warehouse in Queens to the cliff on Vormir. He talked about her loyalty, her intelligence, her capacity for growth and change. But what he did not say, what could not be said in such a public forum, was that she had saved him long before he had saved her, that her faith in his judgment had given him the confidence to believe in his own moral instincts. Steve Rogers followed, his eulogy focusing on her tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to protecting innocent people. He spoke of her as a soldier and a leader, someone who had earned the respect of every person who had served alongside her. But he could not mention the private conversations where she had helped him understand that moral complexity was not the same as moral compromise, that good people could disagree about methods while sharing commitment to principles. Tony Stark's remarks were characteristically irreverent, filled with humor and technological metaphors that masked deeper emotions. He talked about her ability to see through pretense and manipulation, her skill at managing personalities that were not designed for cooperation. But he did not speak of the times she had quietly prevented his self-destructive impulses from sabotaging relationships that had become crucial to his psychological stability. Bruce Banner's tribute was the most personal, focusing on her understanding of what it meant to carry something dangerous within yourself, while choosing to use that danger in service of protection rather than destruction. His words came closer than any of the others to acknowledging the complexity of her transformation, the ongoing struggle to define herself according to chosen values rather than imposed programming. But it was Fury's brief remarks that came closest to capturing the full scope of what she had achieved during her years as more than just an operative or teammate. He spoke of her as someone who had proven that redemption was not just possible but sustainable, that people could fundamentally change their nature through the accumulation of choices made according to principles rather than programming. She became someone who could be trusted with anything, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a career out of never trusting anyone completely. Not because she was perfect, but because she had learned to be honest about her imperfections and work around them rather than being controlled by them. The weeks that followed the funeral brought a different kind of challenge for the surviving Avengers and the broader superhero community. They had to learn to function without someone who had served as both tactical coordinator and emotional anchor for the team, someone whose understanding of human nature had allowed her to manage personalities and conflicts that might otherwise have proven destructive. But they also had to grapple with the broader implications of her sacrifice for their understanding of heroism and redemption. If someone who had been literally designed to be a villain could choose to become not just a hero but someone willing to die for strangers, what did that mean for other people struggling with their own dark histories? The question became particularly relevant as Yelena began her own integration into the hero community, carrying forward her sister's work while trying to establish her own identity separate from the Red Room legacy. She possessed the same skills and analytical intelligence, but her personality had been shaped by different experiences and traumas. Where Natasha had been methodical and controlled, Yelena was spontaneous and emotionally expressive. Where Natasha had approached relationships with careful calculation, Yelena trusted her instincts and accepted vulnerability as a necessary component of genuine connection. The differences between them highlighted something important about the nature of personal transformation. There was no single path from victimization to agency, no universal template for overcoming traumatic conditioning. Each person had to find their own way toward authenticity, their own methods for distinguishing between imposed identity and chosen character. For the members of the superhero community who had worked most closely with Natasha, her death created a void that could not be filled by tactical replacements or procedural adjustments. She had been irreplaceable not because of her skills, although those were considerable, but because of her unique understanding of how to build trust among people who had every reason to distrust each other. But her influence continued to shape their behavior and decision-making long after her death. The psychological insights she had shared during their years of working together became part of their operational framework, techniques for managing conflict and maintaining team cohesion that reflected her hard-won understanding of human nature. More broadly, her story became a touchstone for discussions about the possibility of moral transformation in a world where people were increasingly defined by their worst mistakes rather than their best choices. If the Black Widow could become someone worth mourning, if a Soviet assassin could sacrifice herself to save a universe that included people who had never heard her name, then perhaps redemption was not just a theoretical possibility, but a practical goal worth pursuing. The charitable foundation, established in her memory, focused on supporting women who were transitioning out of abusive situations, providing them with resources and training that could help them build new identities based on their own choices rather than others' expectations. It was work that reflected her understanding of what it meant to escape systems designed to control and exploit, the kind of practical assistance that addressed not just immediate safety needs, but long-term psychological recovery. Yelena served on the Foundation's board, using her own experience of Red Room conditioning to develop programs that addressed the specific challenges faced by people whose sense of self had been systematically undermined by institutional abuse. The work was both rewarding and difficult, requiring her to revisit her own trauma while helping others navigate similar territory. But it was also deeply meaningful in ways that connected to her growing understanding of what Natasha had achieved during her years as an Avenger. The transformation from weapon to person was not a destination but a process, something that required daily choice and constant vigilance against the tendency to revert to familiar patterns of thinking and behavior. The memorial service held on the first anniversary of her death was smaller and more personal than the state funeral, attended primarily by people who had known her well enough to understand the complexity of what she had accomplished. The speakers focused not on her heroic deeds but on the quieter moments that had revealed her character, acts of kindness that had no tactical purpose, conversations that had provided comfort rather than strategic advantage, choices that had reflected genuine care for others' well-being. It was during this service that Clint shared a story he had never told before, about a conversation they had during one of their early missions together when she had asked him why he continued to believe in people, despite having seen humanity at its worst. "I told her that the worst people prove that choice matters," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "If people couldn't choose to be evil, then choosing to be good wouldn't mean anything. But she turned it around on me, said that if people could choose to be evil, then choosing to be good meant everything." The observation captured something essential about her worldview during her final years: the understanding that moral choice was both more difficult and more important than most people realized. She had lived with the knowledge that she was capable of terrible things, that the skills and instincts that made her an effective hero could just as easily be used for destruction and manipulation. But instead of being paralyzed by that knowledge, she had used it as motivation to make better choices, to be more thoughtful about the consequences of her actions, to accept responsibility for ensuring that her formidable capabilities served purposes that aligned with her chosen values rather than her imposed programming. As the memorial service concluded and the attendees began to disperse, Yelena found herself standing alone before the simple plaque that bore her sister's name and the dates that bracketed a life defined by transformation. The inscription was brief: Natasha Romanoff, Avenger, Hero, Friend. But it captured something important about how she would be remembered by the people who had known her best. Not as the Black Widow, the Soviet weapon whose kill count was measured in dozens of lives and whose loyalty could be purchased with the right combination of threats and incentives, but as someone who had chosen to become more than what she had been made to be, someone who had proven that the most important battles were often fought within the human heart, rather than on external battlefields. The legacy she left behind was not just in the lives she had saved or the threats she had neutralized, but in the example she had provided of what was possible when someone refused to accept that their past had to define their future. She had shown that redemption was not a destination, but a direction, not a state to be achieved, but a choice to be made repeatedly until it became the foundation of a new identity. In the end, that might have been her greatest victory, not over any external enemy, but over the forces that sought to convince people that they were prisoners of their own history rather than architects of their own destiny. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world balanced precariously between the certainty of night and the promise of morning, the ghosts gathered to pay their respects to one of their own who had finally found peace. They came not in corporeal form, for they had long since transcended such limitations, but as whispers of memory and echoes of influence that touched the lives of everyone who had been shaped by Natasha Romanoff's journey from weapon to woman to hero. The ripples of her transformation continued to spread through the superhero community and beyond, creating waves of change that she would never see but had made inevitable through the choices she had made during her years of learning to be human. In training facilities across the globe, young operatives studied tactical manuals that incorporated techniques she had developed for building trust among suspicious allies. In therapy sessions and support groups, trauma survivors found hope in stories of someone who had overcome conditioning so thorough that it had replaced her original personality entirely. But perhaps most importantly, in the small moments of daily life that define authentic human existence, people made choices that reflected values she had helped them discover or strengthen. They chose vulnerability over strategic advantage, honesty over tactical deception, loyalty over expedience, not because they were trying to honor her memory, but because her example had shown them that such choices were possible even for people who had been taught that they were luxuries that the truly damaged could not afford. Yelena Belova stood in the garden of the compound that had once served as Avengers headquarters, now converted to a training facility for the next generation of heroes who would face threats that no previous generation had been equipped to handle. The morning mist clung to the grass like memories refusing to fade, and she could almost hear her sister's voice in the wind that stirred the leaves of the oak tree that had been planted in her honor. The tree was young still, barely taller than Yelena herself, but its roots had already begun to spread through the rich soil, with the same quiet determination that had characterized Natasha's approach to building relationships. It would grow slowly, requiring patience and care, but eventually, it would provide shelter and stability for creatures who would never know the name of the woman whose sacrifice had made their safety possible. It was, Yelena reflected, an appropriate metaphor for the kind of legacy that mattered most, not the grand gestures that earned headlines and inspired movies, but the persistent influence that shaped how people thought about choice and responsibility, and the possibility of becoming something better than what they had started as. The work of carrying forward that influence had fallen to people like her, individuals who understood from personal experience what it meant to escape systems designed to eliminate independent thought and authentic emotion. It was work that required constant vigilance against the tendency to revert to familiar patterns, the ongoing effort to distinguish between conditioning and conviction, between inherited responses and chosen values. But it was also work that provided profound satisfaction for those who understood its importance. Every woman who escaped an abusive relationship, every former soldier who learned to process trauma without violence, every person who chose to build rather than destroy, despite having been taught that destruction was their primary purpose. All of them were continuing the work that Natasha had begun during her own transformation. The training programs that Yelena had developed for the foundation drew heavily on insights that her sister had shared during their final conversations, techniques for rebuilding identity that went beyond simply replacing bad habits with good ones. The goal was not to create new versions of the same basic template, but to help people discover who they actually were beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation that had been imposed upon them. It was delicate work, requiring both psychological sophistication and genuine empathy for the complexity of the human experience. Too much pressure, and the fragile shoots of authentic selfhood would be crushed before they could take root. Too little guidance and people would remain lost in the maze of conflicting impulses and inherited behaviors that had been designed to keep them trapped. But when the work succeeded, when someone who had been systematically broken discovered that they could choose to become whole again, when a person who had been taught to see themselves as irredeemably damaged realized that redemption was not just possible but sustainable, the results were transformative, not just for the individual, but for everyone in their orbit. The psychological principles that Natasha had discovered during her own journey were being applied in contexts she had never imagined. Military veterans struggling with PTSD found her techniques for compartmentalizing trauma while maintaining emotional connection surprisingly effective. Former gang members used her methods for building trust among people who had been trained to see cooperation as weakness. Even corporate executives dealing with the psychological aftermath of unethical business practices discovered that her insights into the relationship between authentic identity and sustainable performance could help them rebuild their professional relationships on more honest foundations. But it was in the superhero community itself that her influence was most clearly visible and most profoundly important. The new generation of heroes who had begun to emerge in the years following the Infinity War carried themselves differently than their predecessors, with a kind of thoughtful confidence that reflected deeper understanding of the psychological challenges that came with extraordinary power. They had been taught from the beginning that abilities were not the same as identity, that what you could do was far less important than who you chose to be while doing it. They understood that heroism was not a destination but a process, something that required daily choice and constant self-examination, rather than a single moment of dramatic sacrifice. These insights had been hard-won during the early years of superhero activity, paid for with mistakes and miscalculations that had sometimes cost innocent lives. But the lessons had been learned and codified and passed on, creating a foundation of wisdom that would help future heroes avoid some of the pitfalls that had trapped their predecessors. Clint Barton, now serving as a senior instructor at the facility, often found himself sharing stories about Natasha during his classes on tactical psychology and team dynamics. Not the sanitized versions that appeared in official histories, but the real stories about someone who had struggled daily with questions about identity and authenticity and the possibility of genuine redemption. She never stopped being afraid that she might revert to what she had been, he told a group of young trainees during one such session. But she used that fear as motivation to keep making better choices, to keep proving to herself that change was possible. That's what real strength looks like, not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act according to your values despite the doubt. The trainees listened with the kind of intense attention that suggested they understood they were receiving more than just tactical instruction. Many of them came from backgrounds that included their own forms of conditioning and trauma, their own struggles with questions about whether their past had to define their future. For them, Natasha's story was not ancient history but immediate relevance, proof that the most damaged people could sometimes become the most effective healers. That personal experience of darkness could provide unique insights into how to find and maintain light. Steve Rogers, now retired from active fieldwork but still serving as a strategic consultant, had incorporated many of her insights into the protocols that governed how new heroes were recruited and trained. The days of throwing people with extraordinary abilities into combat situations without adequate psychological preparation were over, replaced by comprehensive programs that addressed emotional development alongside tactical skills. She taught us that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones inside our own heads, he observed during a policy meeting focused on mental health resources for active heroes. Training someone to punch through walls is easy. Teaching them to punch through the psychological barriers that prevent them from becoming who they're meant to be, that's the real work. The institutional changes that had emerged from her influence extended beyond training programs to encompass how the superhero community approached questions of justice, redemption, and the treatment of former enemies. The rigid distinction between heroes and villains that had characterized earlier generations had given way to a more nuanced understanding of the factors that shaped individual choices and the possibilities for transformation that existed, even in the most apparently hopeless cases. Villains who expressed genuine interest in changing their behavior were now offered opportunities for rehabilitation, rather than simply being imprisoned or eliminated. The programs were not universally successful. Some people were too damaged or too committed to destructive ideologies to benefit from intervention, but enough succeeded to justify the resources invested in providing alternatives to purely punitive responses. It was an approach that reflected Natasha's understanding that people were not fixed entities but ongoing projects, capable of growth and change under the right circumstances. The woman who had been designed to be irredeemably evil had chosen to become genuinely heroic, and that transformation had implications for how society approached questions of justice and redemption across the board. Tony Stark, in the years before his own sacrifice during the final battle with Thanos, had often spoken about how her example had influenced his approach to technology development and corporate responsibility. The weapons manufacturer who had once sold instruments of destruction to anyone willing to pay for them had learned to consider the long-term implications of his innovations, to take responsibility for ensuring that his creations served constructive rather than destructive purposes. She showed me that you can't just focus on intention, he had said during one of their last conversations. You have to think about implementation, about how your choices will affect people you'll never meet, about whether you're building the kind of world you actually want to live in. It was a perspective that had shaped not just his personal behavior, but the policies of Stark Industries and the technological frameworks that supported superhero operations. The days of developing powerful technologies without considering their potential for misuse were over, replaced by comprehensive evaluation processes that assessed both capabilities and safeguards from the earliest stages of research and development. Bruce Banner's work in theoretical physics had been similarly influenced by her insights into the relationship between power and responsibility. His research into the fundamental forces that governed reality was now explicitly focused on applications that would enhance rather than threaten human flourishing, with built-in safeguards that would prevent his discoveries from being weaponized by others. She understood something that took me years to figure out, he reflected during a lecture at the university where he had returned to teaching. The question isn't whether you have the right to use power, but whether you have the wisdom to use it well. And wisdom is something you have to choose to develop. It doesn't come automatically with intelligence or ability. But perhaps the most profound and lasting aspect of her legacy was visible in the small, daily choices made by ordinary people who had been touched by her story. Social workers who chose to believe in their clients' capacity for change rather than simply managing their problems. Teachers who saw potential in students who had been written off by others. Parents who chose to break cycles of abuse and dysfunction rather than perpetuating them across generations. These people had never met Natasha Romanoff, would never know the details of her transformation from weapon to woman to hero. But they had been influenced by the ripple effects of her choices, by the gradual cultural shift toward believing that redemption was possible even for people who seemed irredeemably damaged. The thread that connected all these influences was the understanding that identity was not fixed, that people could choose to become something different from what they had been made to be, that the most important battles were often fought within the human heart rather than on external battlefields. It was a lesson that required constant relearning, constant recommitment to values that were easy to articulate but difficult to live by consistently. The forces that sought to reduce people to their worst moments, to define them by their failures rather than their potential, were persistent and powerful. But the counter-narrative that Natasha had embodied, the possibility of transformation, the reality of redemption, the hope that people could transcend their origins and become who they chose to be, was equally persistent and ultimately more powerful because it aligned with the deepest human aspirations for growth and meaning. As Yelena stood in the morning light, watching the sun rise over the compound where her sister had learned to become more than what she had been designed to be, she understood that the real memorial was not the tree or the foundation or the training programs, important though they were. The real memorial was in the lives that were different because one woman had refused to accept that her past had to define her future, had chosen to believe that she could become someone worth becoming, had proven through daily choice and accumulated sacrifice that redemption was not just a beautiful theory, but a practical possibility. The Black Widow had been a creature of shadows, moving through the world with deadly precision and cold calculation, serving masters who saw her as property rather than person. But Natasha Romanoff had chosen to step into the light, to build relationships based on trust rather than manipulation, to use her formidable abilities in service of values she had selected rather than programming she had inherited. In the end, that choice, repeated daily for years, maintained despite doubt and setback, and the constant temptation to revert to familiar patterns had become the foundation of a legacy that would endure long after the specific details of her story had faded from memory. The spider's thread that connected her past to her future, her conditioning to her choice, her isolation to her belonging, had become a lifeline for others who found themselves trapped in webs, not of their own making. By showing that such threads could be broken, that new patterns could be woven, that people could choose to become the authors of their own stories rather than characters in narratives written by others, she had given the greatest gift one person could give another. She had proven that change was possible. And in a world where too many people had been taught that they were prisoners of their own history, that proof was worth more than all the tactical victories and strategic successes combined. The morning light grew stronger, burning away the mist and illuminating the garden where new life grew from soil enriched by sacrifice. And in that light, the legacy continued not as memory or monument, but as living influence that touched every person who chose hope over despair, growth over stagnation, love over fear. The spider's thread endured, stronger than the forces that had tried to break it, more flexible than the systems that had tried to control it, more beautiful than the shadows that had tried to hide it. And in its endurance, Natasha Romanoff achieved the only kind of immortality that truly mattered, not the preservation of her name in history books, but the continuation of her influence in the choices made by people who understood that they, too, could choose to become something more than what they had been designed to be. The Black Widow was dead, but the woman who had chosen to transcend that identity lived on in every person who refused to accept that their past had to define their future, in every choice made from conscience rather than conditioning, in every act of love that conquered the forces of control and exploitation. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world balanced precariously between the certainty of night and the promise of morning, the ghosts gathered to pay their respects to one of their own who had finally found peace. They came not in corporeal form, for they had long since transcended such limitations, but as whispers of memory and echoes of influence that touched the lives of everyone who had been shaped by Natasha Romanoff's journey from weapon to woman to hero. The ripples of her transformation continued to spread through the superhero community and beyond, creating waves of change that she would never see but had made inevitable through the choices she had made during her years of learning to be human. In training facilities across the globe, young operatives studied tactical manuals that incorporated techniques she had developed for building trust among suspicious allies. In therapy sessions and support groups, trauma survivors found hope in stories of someone who had overcome conditioning so thorough that it had replaced her original personality entirely. But perhaps most importantly, in the small moments of daily life that define authentic human existence, people made choices that reflected values she had helped them discover or strengthen. They chose vulnerability over strategic advantage, honesty over tactical deception, Loyalty over expedience, not because they were trying to honor her memory, but because her example had shown them that such choices were possible even for people who had been taught that they were luxuries that the truly damaged could not afford. Yelena Belova stood in the garden of the compound that had once served as Avengers headquarters, now converted to a training facility for the next generation of heroes who would face threats that no previous generation had been equipped to handle. The morning mist clung to the grass like memories refusing to fade, and she could almost hear her sister's voice in the wind that stirred the leaves of the oak tree that had been planted in her honor. The tree was young still, barely taller than Yelena herself, but its roots had already begun to spread through the rich soil with the same quiet determination that had characterized Natasha's approach to building relationships. It would grow slowly, requiring patience and care, but eventually, it would provide shelter and stability for creatures who would never know the name of the woman whose sacrifice had made their safety possible. It was, Yelena reflected, an appropriate metaphor for the kind of legacy that mattered most, not the grand gestures that earned headlines and inspired movies, but the persistent influence that shaped how people thought about choice and responsibility, and the possibility of becoming something better than what they had started as. The work of carrying forward that influence had fallen to people like her, individuals who understood from personal experience what it meant to escape systems designed to eliminate independent thought and authentic emotion. It was work that required constant vigilance against the tendency to revert to familiar patterns, the ongoing effort to distinguish between conditioning and conviction, between inherited responses and chosen values. But it was also work that provided profound satisfaction for those who understood its importance. Every woman who escaped an abusive relationship, every former soldier who learned to process trauma without violence, every person who chose to build rather than destroy, despite having been taught that destruction was their primary purpose. All of them were continuing the work that Natasha had begun during her own transformation. The training programs that Yelena had developed for the Foundation drew heavily on insights that her sister had shared during their final conversations, techniques for rebuilding identity that went beyond simply replacing bad habits with good ones. The goal was not to create new versions of the same basic template, but to help people discover who they actually were beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation that had been imposed upon them. It was delicate work, requiring both psychological sophistication and genuine empathy for the complexity of the human experience. Too much pressure, and the fragile shoots of authentic selfhood would be crushed before they could take root. Too little guidance and people would remain lost in the maze of conflicting impulses and inherited behaviors that had been designed to keep them trapped. But when the work succeeded, when someone who had been systematically broken discovered that they could choose to become whole again, when a person who had been taught to see themselves as irredeemably damaged realized that redemption was not just possible but sustainable, the results were transformative, not just for the individual, but for everyone in their orbit. The psychological principles that Natasha had discovered during her own journey were being applied in contexts she had never imagined. Military veterans struggling with PTSD found her techniques for compartmentalizing trauma while maintaining emotional connection surprisingly effective. Former gang members used her methods for building trust among people who had been trained to see cooperation as weakness. Even corporate executives dealing with the psychological aftermath of unethical business practices discovered that her insights into the relationship between authentic identity and sustainable performance could help them rebuild their professional relationships on more honest foundations. But it was in the superhero community itself that her influence was most clearly visible and most profoundly important. The new generation of heroes who had begun to emerge in the years following the Infinity War carried themselves differently than their predecessors, with a kind of thoughtful confidence that reflected deeper understanding of the psychological challenges that came with extraordinary power. They had been taught from the beginning that abilities were not the same as identity, that what you could do was far less important than who you chose to be while doing it. They understood that heroism was not a destination but a process, something that required daily choice and constant self-examination, rather than a single moment of dramatic sacrifice. These insights had been hard-won during the early years of superhero activity, paid for with mistakes and miscalculations that had sometimes cost innocent lives. But the lessons had been learned and codified and passed on, creating a foundation of wisdom that would help future heroes avoid some of the pitfalls that had trapped their predecessors. Clint Barton, now serving as a senior instructor at the facility, often found himself sharing stories about Natasha during his classes on tactical psychology and team dynamics. Not the sanitized versions that appeared in official histories, but the real stories about someone who had struggled daily with questions about identity and authenticity and the possibility of genuine redemption. She never stopped being afraid that she might revert to what she had been, he told a group of young trainees during one such session. But she used that fear as motivation to keep making better choices, to keep proving to herself that change was possible. That's what real strength looks like, not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act according to your values despite the doubt. The trainees listened with the kind of intense attention that suggested they understood they were receiving more than just tactical instruction. Many of them came from backgrounds that included their own forms of conditioning and trauma, their own struggles with questions about whether their past had to define their future. For them, Natasha's story was not ancient history, but immediate relevance. Proof that the most damaged people could sometimes become the most effective healers. That personal experience of darkness could provide unique insights into how to find and maintain light. Steve Rogers, now retired from active fieldwork, but still serving as a strategic consultant, had incorporated many of her insights into the protocols that governed how new heroes were recruited and trained. The days of throwing people with extraordinary abilities into combat situations without adequate psychological preparation were over, replaced by comprehensive programs that addressed emotional development alongside tactical skills. She taught us that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones inside our own heads, he observed during a policy meeting focused on mental health resources for active heroes. Training someone to punch through walls is easy. Teaching them to punch through the psychological barriers that prevent them from becoming who they're meant to be, that's the real work. The institutional changes that had emerged from her influence extended beyond training programs to encompass how the superhero community approached questions of justice, redemption, and the treatment of former enemies. The rigid distinction between heroes and villains that had characterized earlier generations had given way to a more nuanced understanding of the factors that shaped individual choices and the possibilities for transformation that existed, even in the most apparently hopeless cases. Villains who expressed genuine interest in changing their behavior were now offered opportunities for rehabilitation, rather than simply being imprisoned or eliminated. The programs were not universally successful. Some people were too damaged or too committed to destructive ideologies to benefit from intervention, but enough succeeded to justify the resources invested in providing alternatives to purely punitive responses. It was an approach that reflected Natasha's understanding that people were not fixed entities but ongoing projects, capable of growth and change under the right circumstances. The woman who had been designed to be irredeemably evil had chosen to become genuinely heroic, and that transformation had implications for how society approached questions of justice and redemption across the board. Tony Stark, in the years before his own sacrifice during the final battle with Thanos, had often spoken about how her example had influenced his approach to technology development and corporate responsibility. The weapons manufacturer who had once sold instruments of destruction to anyone willing to pay for them had learned to consider the long-term implications of his innovations, to take responsibility for ensuring that his creations served constructive rather than destructive purposes. She showed me that you can't just focus on intention, he had said during one of their last conversations. You have to think about implementation, about how your choices will affect people you'll never meet, about whether you're building the kind of world you actually want to live in. It was a perspective that had shaped not just his personal behavior, but the policies of Stark Industries and the technological frameworks that supported superhero operations. The days of developing powerful technologies without considering their potential for misuse were over, replaced by comprehensive evaluation processes that assessed both capabilities and safeguards from the earliest stages of research and development. Bruce Banner's work in theoretical physics had been similarly influenced by her insights into the relationship between power and responsibility. His research into the fundamental forces that governed reality was now explicitly focused on applications that would enhance rather than threaten human flourishing with built-in safeguards that would prevent his discoveries from being weaponized by others. She understood something that took me years to figure out. He reflected during a lecture at the university where he had returned to teaching. The question isn't whether you have the right to use power, but whether you have the wisdom to use it well. And wisdom is something you have to choose to develop. It doesn't come automatically with intelligence or ability. But perhaps the most profound and lasting aspect of her legacy was visible in the small, daily choices made by ordinary people who had been touched by her story. Social workers who chose to believe in their clients' capacity for change rather than simply managing their problems. Teachers who saw potential in students who had been written off by others. Parents who chose to break cycles of abuse and dysfunction rather than perpetuating them across generations. These people had never met Natasha Romanoff, would never know the details of her transformation from weapon to woman to hero. But they had been influenced by the ripple effects of her choices, by the gradual cultural shift toward believing that redemption was possible even for people who seemed irredeemably damaged. The thread that connected all these influences was the understanding that identity was not fixed, that people could choose to become something different from what they had been made to be, that the most important battles were often fought within the human heart rather than on external battlefields. It was a lesson that required constant relearning, constant recommitment to values that were easy to articulate but difficult to live by consistently. The forces that sought to reduce people to their worst moments, to define them by their failures rather than their potential, were persistent and powerful. But the counter-narrative that Natasha had embodied, the possibility of transformation, the reality of redemption, the hope that people could transcend their origins and become who they chose to be, was equally persistent and ultimately more powerful because it aligned with the deepest human aspirations for growth and meaning. As Yelena stood in the morning light, watching the sun rise over the compound where her sister had learned to become more than what she had been designed to be, she understood that the real memorial was not the tree or the foundation or the training programs, important though they were. The real memorial was in the lives that were different because one woman had refused to accept that her past had to define her future, had chosen to believe that she could become someone worth becoming, had proven through daily choice and accumulated sacrifice that redemption was not just a beautiful theory, but a practical possibility. The Black Widow had been a creature of shadows, moving through the world with deadly precision and cold calculation, serving masters who saw her as property rather than person. But Natasha Romanoff had chosen to step into the light, to build relationships based on trust rather than manipulation, to use her formidable abilities in service of values she had selected rather than programming she had inherited. In the end, that choice repeated daily for years, maintained despite doubt and setback, and the constant temptation to revert to familiar patterns had become the foundation of a legacy that would endure long after the specific details of her story had faded from memory. The spider's thread that connected her past to her future, her conditioning to her choice, her isolation to her belonging, had become a lifeline for others who found themselves trapped in webs, not of their own making. By showing that such threads could be broken, that new patterns could be woven, that people could choose to become the authors of their own stories rather than characters in narratives written by others, she had given the greatest gift one person could give another. She had proven that change was possible. And in a world where too many people had been taught that they were prisoners of their own history, that proof was worth more than all the tactical victories and strategic successes combined. The morning light grew stronger, burning away the mist and illuminating the garden where new life grew from soil enriched by sacrifice. And in that light, the legacy continued not as memory or monument, but as living influence that touched every person who chose hope over despair, growth over stagnation, love over fear. The spider's thread endured, stronger than the forces that had tried to break it, more flexible than the systems that had tried to control it, more beautiful than the shadows that had tried to hide it. And in its endurance, Natasha Romanoff achieved the only kind of immortality that truly mattered, not the preservation of her name in history books, but the continuation of her influence in the choices made by people who understood that they, too, could choose to become something more than what they had been designed to be. The Black Widow was dead, But the woman who had chosen to transcend that identity lived on in every person who refused to accept that their past had to define their future, in every choice made from conscience rather than conditioning, in every act of love that conquered the forces of control and exploitation. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.